At first, I just said, guys, you don't understand. But after a while, this actually started to really get to me. I started asking the question internally, like, am I wasting my time? Am I dreaming? Am I, taking away from my ability to progress in my career by clinging on to this pipe dream in a sense? And I was pretty close to finally coming up to the boss there and just telling him, like, hey man, so I graduated college, internship done. Thank you for the opportunity, and separating ways. Getting closer and closer. And then there's one day in particular where the head of coaching there, Brandon Sen, pulled me into his office, and he prefaced by saying something to the effect of, we really appreciate how long you've been here, despite us not paying you a single cent. We appreciate the questions that you've been asking, the things you've been doing, so yeah, and just slid me a piece of paper. And I picked up the piece of paper, and I was completely unaware what was happening because, again, pipe dream. I started to realize that. And I looked at the piece of paper, and at the top it said, strength coach employment form. And I'm like, is this real life? There's no way. And I started reading through it, and it's all the agreements and the pay and stuff like that. And it was one of those movies. And for a lot of people out there, they might be hearing this like, dude, it's a strength coaching job. Like, it's not that big. It's not that real, or whatever you want to say. Not that serious. But for me, it was everything, like absolutely everything. And I started reading through it, and it's like one of those movie scenes where like all the noise around you just kind of drowns out, and that kind of scene. And I just read through it, and I read through it again, and then I realized I didn't hear the last few paragraphs that he said to me. And finally I looked up, and he said something I didn't hear. I didn't respond to it. He goes, Brandon, do you accept? And I had to play it off so much. It's like, hey, if you want my talents, yeah, sure. I was just internally freaking out though.
Sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, our guest is Brandon Morgan, strength coach and director of education at Saprogenic and the Strength Lab. Right? Got that down. Basically, co-owner of several gyms. You've been coaching for forever. Right. So we're just going to jump into topics and kind of go through here. But I have one question that we're going to start with. Then we'll get into your origin story. Then we're going to get into some topics that we have, because that's where it's going to be fun. Right. Yeah. The question I'm going to throw out is a question Tom and I had yesterday. And it's a question that we've all been asked several times, but it was one of those that it just couldn't leave my brain even after I got home. And that is, to be a good coach, should you have competed?
That's right? A really good question.
Well, it is. And we've all heard it a lot of times, and it becomes a Instagram meme and a meme across all things. And yesterday when we were answering this question, it was kind of multifaceted how it came out. So I'd love to have your perspective on that. Then we can kind of recap, what we said yesterday. Then I had some additional thoughts that kind of came to my head with that as well.
2 a.m. Wilson's still rattling.
Well, I was out by then, but it was one of those, and every time you do any kind of clinic or seminar, there's always one thing that you're like reflecting on. And that couldn't leave my brain for whatever reason, because there was something that he said, which I'll let him bring up later. Well, actually, I'll throw it out right now. This seems to only be a conversation in powerlifting, but not other sports, which that took me down all these different rabbit holes. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm very interested to hear you guys' opinion on this. From my take, to preface, there's definitely some great coaches out there that have never competed, but they're rare. They're very, very, very rare. There's also a lot of coaches out there that have competed extensively, achieved world records, and I would be very adamant in saying they're not very good coaches. So with that being said, my opinion would be, in most cases, you have to have some semblance of experience to really understand what the lifter is going through, to have the necessary context. You have to be there to really understand how to guide them through it, especially in a meet prep, especially when, shit hits the fan in a sense, especially when they're getting ready to do a big lift. If you've ever done a big lift, they're getting ready to squat 800 pounds, go for an all-time world record deadlift, whatever the case may be, it's rather hard to talk them through it. It's really rather hard to really understand what they're going through and to guide them the right direction to get them to calm down and execute. So having some semblance of competition experience certainly helps extensively. But to say that it's absolutely not, or to say it's absolutely not needed, I don't think is entirely accurate. To say that you don't have to and you can still be a great coach. I'm kind of a fence sitter in this regard. In most cases, you have to be some kind of competitor, but at the same time, you don't have to be the best in the world to be a great coach, to put it simply. But I've never been asked that? It's a very interesting question.
Well, I think most good coaches are ones that sit on the fence and kind of ping pong this back and forth, because as you were answering that, I don't disagree with any of that, but on the far end of the spectrum, you could take it as deep as, if you've never squatted 1,000 pounds, you probably shouldn't coach somebody that squats 1,000 pounds, because the way that bar is going to react is going to be way different than it does with 400 or with a Kabuki deadlift bar. If you've never pulled over whatever weight it takes to pull the full whip out, so probably 5-6 plates, you would know that probably better than I can. That's going to be completely different than how Grigsby's going to have to navigate basically 3 pulls with 1 pull. So we can keep going down there and say, well, that would mean that he could be the only one that could ever coach somebody that's got that, but those are all kind of on the perimeter, in the margins, which is where most people argue. But the one thing that kept coming to my head, because it was based upon what you said, is when you look at the people who are making most of the comments, like, yeah, you 100% should compete, they've all competed, right? And the people that say you 100% don't have to compete have never competed. You've never seen the inverse, of that, right? Where it's kind of that middle ground type of thing, but go into how you were explaining it.
Yeah, well, I think, like I said, this does seem to be the only sport where people ask, like, if an NFL team hires a head coach, no one ever says, like, well, was he a good player? And there are players who have gone on to be good coaches, but what is the percentage of those versus usually what generally happens is they were completely average or subpar players that then switch to coaching or something like that. And I gave the example of when people ask that question, it's usually loaded with the preconception that they're competing at a super high level. When someone says your coach should have competed, they're not usually talking about someone who's done a couple of local meets and is decent. They almost go with the expectation of, they think hiring a coach is someone who should be like at the same performance level that you're at. But like I said, in no other sport do we have that idea in our head. And I kind of made the point that if you want the coach who has dedicated their life to being the best coach humanly possible, that probably does not leave room to be the best possible athlete also, even if they have the genetic potential and everything else to do that. Because you kind of have to, anyone who's been all in at trying to be the best athlete knows what that takes. Anyone who's been truly all in on trying to be the best in their career or whatever that might be also know the time that you can't do them both at the same time, right? So maybe they phased from being a great lifter to a great coach later on, but obviously they're learning then later on in life. So a lot of the times one kind of almost straight away is going to limit at least the amount of time you can dedicate to the other. And then kind of the other point that I brought was that when people go in with the preconception that not only should they be competing, but they should be notable, is that a lot of the best athletes, let's say the highest performing athletes, a lot of the times are actually the worst in terms of movement, knowledge, and all that type of thing. Because a lot of, and I'm not discrediting the work that has gone into the performance, but they're the people that got under a bar on day one and just squatted and it was great. Like I brought up the example of Usain Bolt. A sprint coach will tell you Usain Bolt runs wrong. Like his first 2 or 3 steps especially is different to any other elite sprinter out there. He can't tell you why probably that is, and he wouldn't be able to probably coach someone how to start a sprint like he does, because for him it's running. It's what he does. It's what he was born to do. And maybe if you really dug down to it, he could give you some information, but you probably couldn't take a rank beginner and work them up the levels there. So sometimes the most gifted athlete is not the person to learn from because they haven't hit quite as many roadblocks on the way to the performance level that they've gotten to. And like I said, I'm not saying that to discredit people at that level, but at the end of the day, if you're at the top, there's going to be at least some element of why you're at the top. Yeah. Like you're doing something that you are good at, whether it's proportions, muscle fiber ratio, motor learning ability, whatever. So sometimes maybe if we're talking in complete absolutes and generals, maybe the best coaches are the ones that are in the trenches but aren't spectacular, and the ones that have to grind for every pound on the bar because they're the ones that have to problem solve the most. do you want to learn? And I think this is the example I gave yesterday. Like, some lifters have deadlifted 800 after lifting for 2 years. And some people have I think it was like Ed Cohen deadlifted 400 or 500 the first time he deadlifted. And again, nothing to take away from him, but what did they learn to get to 800 in 2 years versus what about the guy who competed for 15 years to deadlift 600? And that was his absolute pinnacle of performance. Like, there isn't another pound that can go on that bar, no matter what he does. Mm-hmm. Which one do you want to learn from? Sure, he doesn't know what deadlifting 800 feels like, but he's solved more puzzles and more problems than the guy who's deadlifted 800 after 2 years.
Yeah, I would value that attribute a lot, because overcoming sticking points is why people hire a coach. Yeah. I mean, if everything's going really well, they're not going to actually contact the coach. And the people that have run into that scenario, in the demographic I've grown up in, it's usually like a 400 bench. I don't want to say it's easy to get to that 400 pound bench, but with consistency, time, and if they're using PEDs and stuff like that, it kind of is. But then it gets a little dicey. Sure. Right. And normally the first thing that person does is going to be what's going to break that plateau. It can take time and time and time to be able to do that. The one thing we didn't mention yesterday that popped in my head was their ability to communicate. Yes,
which we spoke briefly about there.
Which is huge, and that's something that you could vet really easy online, because granted, Instagram Shorts and stuff like that, they're marketing, right? So yes, people are going to use absolutes and whatever they do just to be able to have the impressions and stuff. So let's just forgive those for now. Unless that's all they do. True. Right. If that's all they do. But now if you get them on a podcast or you listen to any of their long form content, and then you can start to see, where's their humility? If they're speaking with other people, are they dominating the conversation? Are they trying to actually learn, from that? So you can kind of see all that. And because that's going to be what they're going to have to do with the client. Is to be able to do that. Sure. And one of the things that we talked about yesterday was if somebody's making progress and a coach wants to change what they're doing, it's kind of stupid, or at least try to diagnose why they're making progress, because that can become tricky too, because they may be making progress despite what they're doing, but, or they think X is what's contributing to the result, but it's actually Y and Z.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, then they get married to that X.
And yeah, absolutely. And to take a step further to add to what you said, I have found that whether it's wrestling, powerlifting, whatever the case may be, boxing is another really good example. The best coaches I've ever seen on average, to your point, are either subpar or a little bit above it. That's probably the most common scenario as far as the greatest coaches that I've ever seen. But also I say this kind of often, and this is something that can come off as a bit condescending, but oftentimes the best athletes in the world are relatively selfish, at least with their time, at least, not in a bad way by any means. They have to be. They have to be very successful. And the best coaches in the world are very selfless. And to have both those qualities going on at once is extraordinarily challenging. I know very few people that have succeeded within that. So it's a really interesting conversation, but there's also something that takes place a lot in wrestling. And wrestling, it's very common as well as far as this conversation. Powerlifting and wrestling, this question's brought up a lot, and in wrestling the consensus is more so no, they have to be elite. That's usually the consensus that's actually brought up. But yeah, it's a very interesting conversation. On top of that, I don't think there's necessarily a very clear answer, because to your point, here's the thing. I've been around a lot of very elite level lifters, wrestlers, and unfortunately, oftentimes they conclude that their path to success is the only path to success.
Yeah,
they become very dogmatic with their beliefs, and they give and this is not in all cases, but they often give the same 12-week prep or whatever the case may be that they succeeded with, and that ends up being the only way you can succeed because that's what they used. Very rarely does that happen with somebody who's subpar, a little bit above it, as a really good coach. They tend to understand the individuality of programming, everything that goes into it. So on average, definitely the subpar to a little bit above it are oftentimes the best coaches, but this is also a conversation that's rampant in the world of wrestling.
Yeah, I would also say when you said, I would say almost always, right? Because it's definitely more than 50-50. Right. It's 90% from what I've seen. 90% are going based upon what their bias is and moving through there. Another component of this, which I didn't realize when I think it was the first time I had Mike to share out, is, I have that grading system,
Sure.
what makes a good coach, years of experience, how far did they go in the sport, who have they created in the sport, how far have they gone, education. It's like 6 different attributes scaled and so forth, and put a lot of thought into doing that. And I think it has a lot of validity, but he kind of flipped everything upside down when I was talking to him, because he took that same thing when he started messing around with BJJ. Right. And he's like, okay, I'm going to use this to be able to find the best coach I can possibly find. And it checked all those boxes. But the one box that wasn't in there was, how good are they at training absolute beginners? Right? Because if that's all that you're working with, are people that are intermediate and advanced, which my scale definitely is going to lean toward, then they don't know how to work with a true beginner, or they don't have the patience to be able to work with a true beginner. So that kind of plays into that conversation as well as everybody who aspires to be an online coach or is an online coach all started with one client.
Yeah.
Right. So that becomes more price discretion. If you're the consumer, like if you can't afford a really good coach, then there's probably a lot of potentially really good coaches out there that you can get very affordable because they're just starting. But the risk is going to be higher, which is why the price is going to be lower.
Yeah.
Right. So it kind of plays into that. So I think to a certain degree, and this has gotten a little bit better. I didn't think it was going to. And to a certain degree, the price will dictate that. I still think really good online coaches can't price themselves to what they're actually worth, just because that's how the market works. And when you have to compete against the person that's doing it for $100 a month or whatever it is, and you're trying to do this and watch 3 hours of videos per week and put a lot of thought into that, I did the math on it one time, and I don't even want to say what it was, but it was very low. It's like $3 an hour or something like that. And so that kind of falls on that consumer education end, to be able to do that. But it's definitely gotten better over time, where more of the better coaches are able to do that. But some of them, there's always gray. Some of them are just leveraging their social media following, is that what I'm trying to say? Presence for a higher price. Because the perceived value is going to be higher because they have that, which is not true.
The thing that Brandon mentioned, just to backtrack a little bit, you mentioned about different paths. That is, I think, is probably the biggest determining factor. I think what comes with the 2 examples I gave about, the 800 deadlifter in 2 years, the 600 deadlifter in 15 years. How many different training systems has the latter used? How many different tools has he accumulated in his toolbox? Because sure, the coach that's only ever trained one way might have one tool. And if that tool works, whether it's conjugate, linear periodization, if you fall into the bracket of people that contextually that is a good system for you, great. But if you've got a coach who's tried every system under the sun, scraping away for those 2 pounds every year or whatever it might be, then they have the ability to pivot way more than someone who's only been exposed to 1 or 2. And, because then you've decreased your risk. They might not be a master in all training systems, because who on earth can be? But maybe you don't need to be. You just need to be good enough that you can make them some kind of progress. So if you fall into that demographic that, okay, maybe conjugate doesn't work for you, maybe high frequency doesn't work for you, whatever, they're not just lost. They have all these other tools and systems they can bring into play that are still logically sound, that they can use to keep you progressing. And at the end of the day, is that not what you hire a coach for? Because they have more tools than you do.
Yes.
Like, anyone can buy a cookie cutter program. You don't have the tools to edit it or change it to make it optimal for you. So that's why so to me, it's about how many tools do they have? And then to your point, how good are they at assessing the individual to what their needs and communicating?
Yes. Well, that's kind of leaning into what Brandon was saying about people will get kind of dogmatic and locked into their bias, and we see that happen more than we don't, right? And so that's a big part of all that. But if they're multifaceted, they have different tools in the toolbox. And one of those tools, which going back to the communication aspect, is they may not necessarily have to know how to do a water cut, if it's a powerlifting meet or whatever it's going to be, as long as they know the people who do know how to do that.
Sure.
Right. So their own network plays a big factor into this as well, because you can't be highly skilled at everything, but you can have a group of people that you can go to, to be able to help with that, which over a long term will build into being able to have that skill set for everything. And I think what happens with a lot is they run into those situations that's just a little bit out of their wheelhouse. And because of ego or not having a good network, they don't reach out, or they're afraid the person's going to steal their client or whatever reason it's going to be. They don't want to reach out to somebody else to kind of help them with this one aspect. So then they'll just start looking online at all kinds of different shit and then just kind of randomly pull, not knowing if that actually is effective or not effective, instead of reaching out to their network to say, look, I got this sticky point here. I've tried this. And really good coaches will always step up and be able to help, because they know it will reciprocate. That at some point in time, they're going to run into a roadblock. Then they can go back to that person and say, well, how did you handle this one? That's the one thing that I've seen with a really good coach is, if we're speaking online because there's more limitations, is that they have the go-to people to be able to do that and not have to worry about this asshole's going to try to steal my client or whatever it's going to be. So in essence, when you have somebody like that, you're kind of hiring a team.
Yeah. And on top of that too, one other thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is that the lifter that struggled and didn't grow like a weed from whatever the hell they tried, they got the privilege of experimenting. And oftentimes lifters that deadlift 600, 700, 800 pounds in the first few years, which unbelievably enough, I've certainly seen it, they didn't have to experiment. And unfortunately, when you're charging somebody for coaching, you don't really have the right to experiment because they're paying you good money. You don't want to try something with no belief or no certainty that's going to work. But the one that had to grind to that 500-600 pound deadlift for many years, whatever the case may be, they've tried every program under the earth. They have scraped and clawed to get to where they're at. And because of that, there's an unbelievable amount of experience that's been built with experimenting around with virtually every program they can, trying different strategies, different tempos, different techniques. While the other end of things, the lifter that just grew like a weed, whatever he tried first, oftentimes he never got that privilege to experiment. Therefore, he doesn't know the pros, cons, setbacks of other styles of programming.
Yeah, I think that ended up, again, just a reference back to yesterday when we were on the whiteboard and we were talking about how you can periodize different loading zones in your accessory work and stuff like that. And really the end of this 20-30 minute conversation was all of these programs all do the same thing.
Yes.
They just
at the technical level. Yeah. Not just broadly, they all do the same thing at that technical level.
Some of them call it phasing, some of it call it waves, some call it blocks, whatever. But the end goal and end result is always the same. Take you usually from lower loads, and whatever methods dictate lower loads, to progressively heavier loads, whilst giving you the accessory work to prepare you for the higher loads that come later and work on me. And the person who's experimented more hopefully has realized that. Do you know what I mean? And then I think if you do that, then you begin to understand training, or in its grounded form, as opposed to memorizing programs.
Yeah, that's a thing. The principles always stay the same no matter the
they
program.
really do.
And if you look at the research, you compare like linear to undulating or something like that, the results are largely the same. They really are. It depends so much. So with that being said, there's so many people that have a hard bias towards this is the only style, this is the only style. They cherry pick 50 studies to support their case there. But also brings up another interesting note about what you said about whatever the hell they call it. Speaking of you being from the UK, I have a coach from the UK I consistently collaborate with, and sometimes it feels like we speak another language. Every fucking term that I know near and dear to my heart, he calls something fundamentally different. So we have to like get very granular with what do we mean with every single term we use. But even like East Coast to West Coast exercise names and things like that, just kind of a funny side note. It's incredible how many names a technique and exercise, things like that can go by. So it's just kind of a funny note.
But that almost represents, because that's a cultural thing, obviously, right? But then there's also a culture within training systems.
Yes.
Like people who have athletic performance backgrounds, conjugate, they're all different mini cultures, right? So again, like what's called a wave in conjugate could just be called a block or a phase over here. We are so these pools argue, but we're actually agreeing on like 98% of the things, and most of the arguments come from the fact that we just call them different things, or we implement them slightly differently. But actually, we're actually all just really nodding in agreement with each other. We just don't really know it.
So much time is wasted. That way.
I mean, just on simple things, I can't even remember the number of times, with podcast guests that I've had to, anchor what volume is, what intensity is, what workload is, and what effort is, right? Because bodybuilders are going to think intensity is, how hard you're, what we would think is effort, but intensity, we're going to think it's a percentage of a 1 rep max. Volume for some is sets times reps. For me, that's all it is. For others, it's sets times reps times weight, which would be workload, right? So when you're talking volume, it's like we got to anchor this to be able to continue this conversation, which sometimes can be frustrating, especially if they don't really know. Then it's really frustrating.
Oh yeah.
So I guess I'll close this segment down with a little bit of advice, and that would be vet the coach. If you're a client, vet the coach, and the reason for that is I would never advise to stay with a coach for less than a year, which people are going to cringe at that, right? But they have to learn you, and you kind of have to learn them. Now, if we compound that out based upon a lifetime value, you're looking at, $3,500 to $5,000 per year as an investment. If you were to purchase anything that costs $5,000, you're probably going to do a little more research than looking at a couple Instagram shorts. Right. You're going to take some time, and you're going to do a deep dive to be able to see, is this person filling these boxes that we said? Have they run into sticking points? Do they know how to communicate? Do they know all that? And nobody's ever going to be able to legitimize in my brain that you shouldn't take time to be able to do that when it's close to a $5,000 a year investment. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're really, for a longer period of time, then you're probably not really looking for a coach. You're looking for a consultant. So then find the best coach that you can, buy an hour of their time, and then answer the questions. So it's a couple different. Yeah.
And I think also the thing, obviously we've discussed different tools will work for different people. You need that time period to get that. But I think the bit that gets undervalued there is when we had Vinny Uzi out, he was talking about his client that he talks to rather acutely, should we say. And, he's a fat loss client or whatever, and he just says, stop being a fat asshole to him, quite, But like, are you going to say that for a client you've been working with for 2 to 3 weeks? No. Like, as you wouldn't do that, right? Because you're like, no, you need to set the bedrock of our relationship. You need to learn their personality, what type of language works with them. And then you get to the point where they trust you enough that you can say the hard things that maybe a PT in a gym who wants to make sure you're renewing for next month wouldn't be willing to say to you. Because, sometimes you have to say the hard shits because you care, right?
Yeah.
And you can't do that at first because you need to figure out, like, if I am going to say the hard stuff to these people, it needs to be done in a language that is productive.
And online, it's
that's
different.
Even harder again.
Like I can say that shit if I'm working with somebody for the first time in a gym because I can see their reaction. Like, oh shit, I shouldn't have said that. Now I need to find a way to wiggle myself out of the hole I just put myself in. And I can do that. But if you're trying to do this via Skype, email, or whatever it's going to be, you don't want to put yourself in that hole.
Oh yeah,
right.
No. Hard shit they can handle is varies so much, and that's one of the things that I always cover with people in my initial intake. Is they always ask me, so by the end of it, what's the best program for me? What do I need to be doing? Oftentimes, I'm honest with them, like, I don't know yet. Here's what we're going to try. Here's why I think it's going to work, but we need to build a lot of rapport with one another to truly understand how your bodies work. But the athletes out there that coach hop, or however you want to put it, they are doing themselves such a disservice. But as far as communication style to the athlete, the coach gets the ability to adapt to what they respond best with through months of working together. And some of the things that I say to certain clients, I wouldn't dare say to other clients. Like, dear God, if I said it to them, I'd lose them in a day. So all that being said, it's really a rapport building process to understand what they individually respond best to, the communication style, all that stuff. But coach has to earn that through getting to know them through months of time. To take a step further, the athlete needs to give them the opportunity to lay that base, to lay that foundation so that they can actually do their best work. And many athletes, unfortunately, don't understand that, and they'll have a habit of changing coaches every few months. I had an athlete recently like, oh, you're my fifth coach of the year, believe it or not. I don't really want to work with you. And that's a really big red flag. It's a really big red flag. So it's a really important note.
I mean,
there.
Even something basic like queuing, like how many times have you had a client that they have a recurring cue, a fault that you have to try and cue out of them, and it's the 15th cue that you try that suddenly goes. And if you don't give someone, like, sometimes it might take you 2 or 3 months to just find out those 2 words, you know, like, I had someone who was like persistently trying to squat 2 upright, was just always worried about face planting. This was a female client, and eventually the only cue that worked, because I'd been working with her well enough, I was like, say, just point your nipples at the floor, which I would never say to a female that I've been working with for like a month or something, right? And lo and behold, it worked. But every other cue over the last like 2 months could not get in her head about what are you trying to achieve here when I say it. And then boom, it was like night and day difference overnight. Yeah. But if I hadn't been working with her for whatever amount of time it was at that point, I never would have got to the point where I would say that to her. And if she coach hopped every 2 months, you probably run into that same problem. You know? And you know, that's just a tiny little minutia in the really broader picture of what a coach is doing for you, just cueing.
Yeah, but long term, that tiny minutia is huge in returns, is what's going to happen with that lift.
Which is why I hate being asked the question, what's the best cue to accomplish XYZ? I don't fucking know. It matters to the athlete. I don't know. I can give you a dozen of my favorite, but what works best for them really varies a ton. And speaking of inappropriate cues that work insanely effectively, one of my favorites of sumo deadlift is, you know, when somebody is having a really hard time, you know, externally rotating, getting closer to the barbell, pecker to the bar. Works really well for some people. Other people, it doesn't work at all. But then again, even saying that, a little rapport needs to be built to feel comfortable saying that.
What is your origin story? I don't want to spend like an hour going through how you started training to where you are now, but what would be your origin story from, like, how did you start training and then get to the point to where you are now, and kind of the benchmarks along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try not to take too long on this. So it's a rather long story. And I think that there is some good learning tidbits along the ways as far as what I've done across the years. But I really wish I could say that I got into lifting because I saw Ed Cohn squat XYZ and I got really excited about it. I saw Arnold Schwarzenegger. I want to be big like him. But that'd be entirely untruthful. The truth is, why I actually got into lifting is from a very young age, I took a lot of pride in being able to defend other people. I took a lot of pride in that. And I think that's something my parents instilled in me in a very young age, especially my father. And I had this specific experience in 3rd grade where one of my friends was getting bullied. So I figured I'd step up to him, right? You know, show him what's up, tell him to stop doing that. And the second I did, I got punched in the face, thrown into the ground, one of those naturally beefy kids in school that looks like just a little shit brick house. And I remember being on the ground looking up. He's towering above me. Not a single thing I could do. I don't even know how to start doing something. So that immediately transitioned me into wrestling. And when I first started wrestling, we were training, you know, outside singles and double legs. And I'm like, when are we going to break out the chairs and the cages? I thought it was WWE. I had no idea what the hell it was. I was like, this shit's lame. But the further I got into it, the more I liked it. And it got me a lot stronger, got me a lot more mentally tough. Finally, I knew something, at least in regards to actually being able to defend myself and others. And then another experience in middle school where I got in a fight with a kid, and then a few weeks later, his older brother pressed me, right? And I'll never forget, he grabbed me by my jacket, and pressed me up against the fence, like so big, so strong. He's a few years older than me. And my feet came up off the floor. And I remember thinking, oh, you're fucked now. I know wrestling. He was like, not a
Can't do a lot when your
single
feet are
thing
off
I
the
can
ground.
do. Not
Yeah.
a single thing I do. And then that really made me have a realization. And luckily, a parent came in, broke it up.
Yeah.
It didn't really amount to anything, but that made me realize, all right, so you also got to have some weight to you. You also got to be fairly strong to be able to handle yourself and defend others in a sense. So that got me really into lifting. So what that started out as is obviously I'm in 6th grade at the time. I don't have access to a weight room or anything like that. So I had the classic power tower, right? I had the push-up, dip, pull-up machine in my garage.
Mhm.
So I'd start every day, 5 days a week with 100 push-ups, 100 pull-ups, 100 dips, something to that effect. And got some good experience there, got some good gains in a sense. Eventually, I upgraded to a Bowflex, which let me tell you, people hate on, but when you're in middle school, that's a state-of-the-art gym right there. That's a big deal. So I got a Bowflex even, but unfortunately, I didn't gain a lot of muscle. I had to realize that 10 bowls of cereal a day isn't really the optimal fuel in a sense for gaining muscle. But the more I got into it, the more I started to look up to the power lifters, the bodybuilders and things of that nature. More I started to study them quite a bit. And then by the time I got to high school, my wrestling coach allowed me to go to the weight room 5:30 a.m. every single morning right before school. Finally had access to all these pretty new devices and got very into it. And then I started working at Subway. And let me tell you, for any of you youngsters out there that want to start gaining muscle, work in fast food, eat everything in sight. It's a really good hack.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't meal prep. I didn't know how to cook. I didn't know anything like that. But I remember I was like, prepping food for people. I'm like, all right, 1 chicken breast for them, 1 chicken breast in my pocket, 1 chicken breast for them, 1 chicken breast in my pocket. And so every shift I would just eat everything in sight. And I really hope the owner isn't watching this. He might try to come after me.
Getting paid to gain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was incredible. Like seriously, work at Subway. There's some good stuff there. And so anyways, I just ate everything in sight. I took home a bunch of food. It was effortless meal prepping. And at that point in time, I finally started gaining some serious muscle mass, which was fantastic. But by the time I got to about my sophomore year, I played football and I wrestled. And unfortunately, I ran into a situation where there's a lot of reoccurring concussions.
Summer's here and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym, it kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com. This deal is only available through the Table Talk link.
Concussions were a really bad issue for me. And there's one time in particular in a football game where helmet came off. I was a running back. I kept on running the ball and then helmet to head contact knocked the fuck out, just knocked out. And my friends to this day will talk about how, do you remember when coach asked you what your name was and you said Nazareth? I'm like, no, I don't remember that at all.
Yeah.
And so at that point in time, I'd gotten quite a few and it started having some rather large effects. Like I couldn't tell you my phone number, apparently couldn't even tell you my name for many weeks at a time. And I remember I was talking to people like, I'm getting really sick of this concussion thing. You know, when you keep getting knocked out, and like, no, I don't know what you mean. How many times you get knocked out? Mm-hmm. And I came to realize that getting knocked out or just losing consciousness through head trauma like 15 times across your lifespan by the time you're a sophomore in high school isn't super common, as it turns out. So at that point in time, doctors I was working with, people close to me finally told me like, dude, you just got to stop playing contact sports. You're going to ruin your brain. You only get one for the rest of your life. So I kind of met them in the middle and just stuck to wrestling, which is a relatively low head trauma sport, especially compared to something like football. So I leaned into that extremely hard, which by the time I got to my senior year led to some scholarship offers. So I ended up going to a university up in Portland. And since I'd gained a lot of muscle mass, started getting stronger, the second I got there, I kind of stuck out like a sore thumb compared to the other athletes there. They saw I had a little bit of muscle mass on me. It was fairly strong. So they naturally assumed I knew what I was doing. I didn't at all. I was just faking it till I make it, just the something we all do in the beginning. But I remember there was single hour-long lectures for classes where, I mean, it got to a point where 10 people would walk over to me and whisper in my ear, hey man, I need a back and buys day. I want to lean out. Here's the injuries I have. And I would immediately start writing them workouts. And as it turns out, if you want to succeed in school, spending every lecture writing people workouts isn't the best way to use your time. I had to find that out the hard way. But there's single classes where I'd write like 10 different workouts for people. And then at the end of it, I'll go, okay, this one's for you. This one, no, back and buys guy. There you go. So I'd pass them out like a teacher doing grades in a sense. And then I had a massive group of people following me to come train. And people ask me like, why didn't you charge people at the time? Why aren't you charging people? Truth is, for one, I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. I mean, most people work off Excel, Google Sheets, have an app. I was pen and paper. I didn't deserve to charge anybody. But take a step further too. I just immediately thought that was such a ridiculous idea. Like getting paid to do something you would easily do for free. That's ridiculous. There's no way somebody can make a living doing that. There's no way somebody can charge somebody for that. I was very unaware of the possibilities in the fitness industry at the time. But that ended up kind of developing more and more. And by the time I got to my sophomore year of college, I was not doing good in school whatsoever. Not even close. Now, a large part of that was because I was skipping class to work with people in training. I was spending classes, writing people workouts. So that was certainly a large part of it. But unfortunately, concussions kind of followed me. And there's one major one I had where I was drilling with the epitome of a Wednesday night All-American. And for those of you that don't know what that means, it's basically just somebody that goes way too hard, just doesn't know how to drill, is always trying to get in fist fights, scratches your face up, stuff like that. And he drove me like 20 yards back while we were drilling. And I ran into somebody and behind us in referee's position, back of the head to the front of his head, knocked out for like 10, 15 seconds. And that's a long time. That's a rather long time to be knocked out. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. And at that point in time, what took me a few weeks to get relatively back to normal afterwards, turned into a few months. And this happened a few times in a row where it was with 4 weeks left in a semester. So I would have to just drop out of classes constantly because we'd have an exam that count for over half your grade. I couldn't even look at my phone. Like I had to stay indoors, all dark lights, couldn't look at a TV, couldn't look at a phone, couldn't do anything for very long durations of time. So I remember I had this academic advisor that would just go out of his way to try to help me. His name's Robert Campy, great guy. And throughout my first 2 years, he would try to help me so much. And I was a lost cause, let me tell you. And he finally came in after I dropped out another few classes. He came in and he said something to the effect of, all right, Brandon, like big exhale the second he sat down. Energy's completely different. And he goes, all right, Brandon, let's just be honest. You're wasting your time here. You're wasting everybody's time here. You're not taking this seriously. Yeah, sure, wrestling concussions as a large part of it, but you refuse to quit wrestling. You skip classes consistently to go lift with your friends, which is cool, but not good for grades. And to say you're not on track to graduate is a massive understatement. Like, dude, you have 1 semester of credits after 2 years of college. Like, you're not going to graduate. So you're wasting your time. But at that point in time, though, I'd been roofing. I'd been roofing for a few years. I'd worked a lot of odd jobs. I worked in a coal factory, worked a little construction, Subway, as I previously mentioned. And then I ended up roofing, also water delivery boy, which was actually a pretty sweet gig, let me tell you. But I'd been roofing for a few years, make good money doing it, but it's a miserable fucking job. Jeez Louise. And when most people think of roofing, they think of like stuff you do for average houses, like residential, for example, hanging shingles and stuff like that. But we did industrial roofing, which is a special kind of shitty, right? You go on, sometimes 10-story buildings, sometimes 40-story buildings at the highest point imaginable, 100+ degree weather. And you would have to use a pickaxe or whatever you had available to just destroy roofs, lift up massive, uneven, terribly shaped material. Oftentimes you ran into substances you're not supposed to breathe in, which, you'd get 50 cents extra hour hazard pay as you're like actively fucking dying. I'd be covered in fiberglass. I was itchy as hell. It's just miserable. And then some days, you work 9 hours. Sometimes you work 15. Sometimes you get two 15-minute breaks and a half an hour for lunch. Sometimes you get none. They're just impossible to do for long durations of time for me, and foremans weren't all too nice, especially when they know you're a college educated boy and you're just doing this in the summers. They tend to make a bit of a target out of you. So we finished that meeting off by saying, so because of that, just quit. Just go roof for a little bit because you're wasting your time here. And he gets up and he leaves. And he'd been helping me this entire time. So nice, such a good guy. And then all of a sudden he just gave up on me. And this was a very big experience for me because the biggest goal I had going to college is I'm not going to be one of those college dropouts. There's not a chance in hell. I need to graduate. And after that, my first reaction was, fuck him. I was a young kid, obviously. Fuck him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's crazy. But after a few days, I started to come around and be like, yeah, he's probably right. And the fear of doing something for the rest of your life that was so miserable that you had no passion in doing, when that came to fruition in my head, that really lit a fire under me that I've never had before. I'll be honest, I really haven't. So I sat down, I did the math, and I realized that I'd have to take about 20 credits per semester just to graduate fairly on time, which for those of you that don't know, that's a lot. Mm-hmm. That's a whole lot. So once I figured that out, I said, all right, let's fucking do it. And then also I decided to just go full bore into the world of strength training upon realizing that's an actual route that I could go down. So I ended up getting a job as a collegiate strength coach for a wrestling team, which was awesome, wonderful experience. I ended up going straight to a commercial gym and applying to be a personal trainer, which I got. Fantastic. And I just ended up training people at a commercial gym, being a collegiate strength coach, taking 20 credits for a semester, and just surviving. Just very, very busy at the time, but I just leaned into it as hard as I could. And I was so driven at that point that I'm like, all right, here's the thing. I am not going to let a single day go by where I do not spend at least an hour and a half outside of classes just studying stuff online. Like I really want to do this for a living. Again, the fear of roofing for a living really drives you to an unbelievable extent. And upon me doing that, though, I came across one video in particular by Chris Duffin and Mark Bell. And it was something to the effect of the ideal squat warm-up or something like that. And once I saw that, I'm like, holy shit, this guy knows his stuff. He's strong too. So I tried the warm-up, loved it, absolutely loved it. Put a few of my clients through it because, when you're first starting, you just kind of copy and paste and pretend you're not doing so. Kind of like plagiarizing, a college project. You just kind of pretend like I change a few words or whatever. But I did that, admittingly. And the more I looked into what he did, the more excited I got. I'm like, this guy just travels around putting on seminars. He strength trains with all his buddies and all the coaches, and he coaches. That's amazing. That's exactly the life I want to live. Where the hell is Kabuki Strength? So I looked it up, and I figured it'd be somewhere like this, somewhere like Ohio, Texas, Florida, California, something like that, way out of my reach. But I was hoping I could make enough money to maybe visit there or something like that. I found out it was 15 minutes away from my college. Like, what are the fucking chances? So immediately I put my laptop down, went straight there. And funny enough, the very first person I saw training in there was who? The man himself, Chris Duffin. And I'll never forget, he was doing belt squat marches and he was getting ready for an all-time world record squat attempt or total attempt or something to that effect. And I get there, I see him training, and I lose any semblance of self-awareness. I just immediately get in front of him while he's doing belt squat marches. I go, hey, sir, I'm Brandon Morgan. I'll never forget, he looked at me and just kept on going. And I was like, oh, shit. Okay, sorry. Hightailed it out of there. And I came back the next day under a more appropriate scenario. So then I met with the head of coaching and education at the time, Brandon Sen, and I just begged him, like, please let me train here. Because at the time, it was a private training facility. You have to actually apply to go there. And it's a good way to do it if you want to create a solid training environment. And then I also told him, like, hey, I'm a broke college student too, so this $200 initiation fee and these prices, I can't afford that. But if you can let me train here, I'd really appreciate it. And he ended up working with me the best he could, got me a membership there, and I just started going there every fucking day. And to this day, if you ask anybody that was there, I'd be willing to bet they have stories of how much of a nuisance I was just an absolute nuisance. Because I would just walk up person to person, coach to coach, pen and paper. So why did you do that? Oftentimes when they just got done with like a 700-pound squat or something like that. Like, so how did that feel, by the way? Like just the worst questions imaginable. But I just took as many notes as I could, and I loved it. Absolutely loved it. It was incredible. So all that to say, eventually I started getting to the end of my college, and I do an internship. Now, every single other person at my college that worked in personal training and things like that had a similar degree to me, what they did was they simply doubled down. They double dipped. They simply did their internship through the commercial gym they're already working at, got paid to do an internship, which when you're a broke college student sounds pretty fucking attractive. And they basically just hand their boss a paper, say, hey, fill this out, interview me a few times, say I completed at the end. Done deal. It's no extra work. And this is obviously a very attractive thing, especially because most of my days look like waking up at 4:30 a.m. to go strength train the wrestlers, and then doing the morning shift, the opening shift at a commercial gym, then going to classes, back to the gym, classes, back to the gym, to Kabuki Strength to train. Very, very busy days, no free time whatsoever. So that was a logical route to go for the internship. But I just thought, like, how cool would it be to get an internship at Kabuki? How amazing would that be? So I asked a random strength coach there, like, do you guys do internships? And he immediately said, fuck, what would we get out of that? No, we don't do internships. Kind of swatted me down like a fly. And I was like, damn it. Okay. But I kept asking, got in contact with the right people, and I got accepted as the first Kabuki Strength intern, which was just an incredible experience. I got to spend more time there, do class projects with them, and even attend some of the seminars that they did for free. Because I sure shit couldn't afford it. And the more I was around them, the more I just loved what they did. So I just started thinking, like, how can I become a coach here? The first problem was they do a lot of like seminars and public speaking. And if I had to be in front of my classmates for 5 minutes the next day doing a presentation, I would be in near tears beforehand. If I had to do anything along those lines, I couldn't sleep the night before. I was the worst public speaker imaginable. Like, it was just such a big fear of mine. But they're big into public speaking. They all power lifted, and they all did some things like that. They were just far outside my wheelhouse. So while I was interning there, I just started signing up for as many public speaking events as possible. And the first few I did were the roughest imaginable. I have since deleted that footage because it was so bad. I almost wish I would have kept it just to see the development, but at the same time, they were so bad. So I did some for the commercial gym for all the clients we had. I did some through my college. I just started signing up for as many as possible. And since all the coaches there powerlifted, I thought, okay, well, why don't I powerlift? I've always been interested in it, but at the same time, if I'm being completely honest, it was more so a conduit to becoming a coach there, because that's all what they did. So I signed up for my first powerlifting meet. The problem is the $100 initiation fee was just far outside of my reach. I had $10 a week for groceries, so that wasn't happening. So I'll never forget, I sold blood plasma for 2 months just to afford the initiation fee. So those blood plasma people know me pretty well. But afforded the initiation fee, went there, did it, and I went 3 for 9, baby. As it turns out, commands are rather important. I didn't know that. Yeah. I had no idea. In fact, there's 2 comments that family members and friends close to me said during the meet that will never leave my thought or my brain.
So literally, there's blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah. It's horrendous. It's horrendous. And there's 2 comments that was made that'll never leave me. The first of which was someone came up to me and go, you red lights are bad, right? They're bad. I just laughed. And the second of which was, you completed the lift, but you still got red lights. Why did that happen? And there's a rat coming. Whatever. And I just laughed. I was so pissed. So I did terrible, and that immediately made me realize I had a lot more to learn. So yeah. Anyways, point is, started public speaking, started powerlifting, and just really wanted to get a job there. And then as my internship ended, or at least my theoretical internship ended, I graduated. The problem was I didn't want the internship to end because I was learning so much. And keep in mind at the time, especially, like, industry giants would walk into Kabuki on a daily basis. Like, I remember, there'd be times where I saw Stuart McGill, Kelly Starr, Ed Cohn, Mark, like all these people would come in, and I was just in amazement. Every once in a while, I got to pull them aside, ask them a few questions. I was just learning an incredible amount. So I just didn't want the internship to end. And I had it in my head that the second they found out that I no longer needed the internship for school, they'd kick my ass to the side. They wouldn't allow me to do it anymore. Hindsight 2020, they probably would have kept me around. Weren't paying me anything, so why not? But At the time, I thought for sure they'd give me charity. They would have kicked me to the side. So I lied my ass off. I just pretended I was still in school. And every once in a while, a coach or somebody would ask me, like, you're still in college? Like, what? When are you going to graduate? And I just immediately distract from the conversation. I lied for so long. And none of them know that to this day. So if anybody's watching, they'd probably just find that out. But also, this gave me the ability to do something kind of cool, which is I just made up school projects. I was like, man, you're not going to believe this. My professor is making me sit in on every single client update you do, and then making you explain to me why you're doing what. They're making me, I'm sorry. And I made up school projects for so long, learned so much. And my real internship was a few months. My fake internship was close to a year. So I was there forever. Like, no, it's like a high schooler that still hangs around with or like someone that graduates still hanging around with high school kids. It was just kind of off-putting after a while. But I got to a point where I was spending so much time there, it really took away from my ability to have more clients at a commercial gym, make more money. I'm still broke as a joke. It's Portland, right? This is an expensive place to live, really expensive place to live. And people close to me kept on telling me, like, dude, you're not going to get a job there. Like, what are you doing? You're so underqualified. Like, when's the last time they hired somebody your age, your experience? You have no virtual coaching experience. You're a personal trainer at some gym. Like, you're dreaming here, dude. What are you doing? And then more people would tell me, like, dude, you deserve to get paid for all your time there. You deserve more. They're not paying you. Leave them. Just leave them. What are you doing? And at first, I just said, fuck you guys, you don't understand. But after a while, this actually started to really get to me. I started asking the question internally, like, am I wasting my time? Am I dreaming? Am I taking away from my ability to progress in my career by clinging on to this pipe dream in a sense? And I was pretty close to finally coming up to the boss there and just telling him, like, hey, man, so I graduated college, internship done. Thank you for the opportunity. And separating ways. Getting closer and closer. And then there's one day in particular where the head of coaching there, Brandon Sen, pulled me into his office, and he prefaced by saying something to the effect of, we really appreciate how long you've been here, despite us not paying you a single cent. We appreciate the questions that you've been asking, the things you've been doing, so yeah. And just slid me a piece of paper. And I picked up the piece of paper, and I was completely unaware what was happening. Because again, pipe dream, I started to realize that. And I looked at the piece of paper, and at the top it said, strength coach employment form. And I'm like, there's no fucking way. Is this real life? There's no way. And I started reading through it, and it's all the agreements and the pay and stuff like that. And it was one of those movies. And for a lot of people out there, they might be hearing this like, dude, it's a strength coaching job. Like, it's not that big. It's not that real, or whatever you want to say. Not that serious. But for me, it was everything, like absolutely everything. And I started reading through it, and it's like one of those movie scenes where like all the noise around you just kind of drowns out, and that kind of scene. And I just read through it. I read through it again, and then I realized I didn't hear the last few paragraphs that he said to me. And finally I looked up, and he said something I didn't hear. I didn't respond to it. He goes, Brandon, do you accept? And I had to play it off so much. It's like, hey, if you want my talents, yeah, sure. I was just internally freaking out, though. So I accepted the job, signed some paperwork, and he immediately told me, he goes, so yeah, you probably got to put your 2 weeks in at the commercial gym. And I was like, the fuck I do? I'll stop today. Like, you want me to start today? I'll start today. And he goes, no, you don't want to burn any bridges. I'm like, burn bridges? I'll burn the place down. Like, dude, I am here. And he actually kind of had to convince me to quit the right way at my other gym. I put my 2 weeks in, which obviously is a really good idea. By the time I was so excited that I didn't want to. And so anyways, put my 2 weeks in, started working there as a strength coach. But the problem was, going from 100% in person to virtual is a beast. Especially for me. It's a completely different scenery.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Dude, because here's the thing. I had always been somebody that friends would tell me, like, I could never understand your tone when you're texting me. Like, I can never really understand it. I was kind of known as somebody that didn't really answer phone calls the best and answer texts the best. Also, they worked off Excel spreadsheets, which I just notoriously fucked up beyond belief, dude. Like, you give me an Excel spreadsheet for a week, I'll turn it back into you with none of the equations or back systems working. It's terrible. So it was a hard transition that I didn't expect. So for the first few months, on a daily basis, I thought I was getting fired because I didn't have the best retention. The boss there would pull me into his office on the regular, like, dude, this Excel spreadsheet is unfixable. Like, you just got to restart. I don't know what you did. Like, what did you do? Like, this is actually impressive how bad you messed this up. I was messing things up, didn't have the best retention, wasn't communicating effectively. And eventually I started to really catch on. Eventually I started to really do some right things. And there's a few changes that happened that timeline that ended with me starting to figure it out. The first of which is just being on a schedule every single fucking day. There wasn't a single morning that went by where I answered all the client texts, started learning about how to, improve your tone within texting and email and things like that. Found out about something called emojis, which apparently helps them get your tone a little bit more better across. And then also I started doing something new, which is video reviews. For the longest time, Kabuki Strength had just looked at people's videos and then texted back, the corrections or the things that they're seeing. But I eventually just did video reviews instead. And that was the single greatest change I've ever made to my coaching, is doing a weekly video review rather than texting the things that you see in video. Allowed somebody to see your tone, see that you care, allow you to articulate yourself better. So many benefits in association with it. So I started really excelling, doing quite well, in fact. And once I got to about a year in, things changed very quickly to a point where I had fantastic retention. I had, in fact, the most clients or most athletes on the entire coaching staff out of 6-7 people, which was huge. And unfortunately, I don't want to say how many clients I had, because I've now, it took me a while initially, but as many of you know, once you get to a certain amount of clients, it prevents your ability to provide a good experience. It has to degrade at some point. And I definitely surpassed that point, but I had a lot is a point. For example, if I had, let's say 50, which by the way, I had more than that, the second closest on the staff was somebody with 27. So I was making a lot of money for the company, had good retention, had a lot of clients, and was doing extraordinarily well. And eventually, I started really nailing it at seminars too, or at least I think I did, because it started off with, me just adding in a few tidbits here and there, taking over one slide, one section, one day, and then putting on seminars yourself, which is a few years to get to that point. But I got to that point, which is incredible. So I started putting on seminars myself, and eventually I got promoted to director of education, which was incredible. There was a lot of hardships in association with that, as well as just as far as setting up seminars, talking to people about where the seminar is going to be put on, getting people to understand that putting on a seminar requires you to shut down the gym, which a lot of people for some reason just don't understand. I did a few seminars in the beginning that didn't go extraordinarily well. I was kind of shot myself in the foot prior just because I didn't articulate that well enough. But eventually I did pretty good at it. And I did that for a few years. And then about 4 or 5 months ago is where I believe at least, is when I parted ways with the Kabuki Strength because I wanted to start my own gym. And I did so with another coach at Kabuki named Joe Stella and his friend TJ. We took over from a previous gym up in Vancouver, Washington, which is about 15, 20 minutes north of Portland. So we ended up buying out all the equipment, getting a new name, moving into a new building, new branding, all that good stuff, which let me tell you, there's a lot of hardships involved with that. I did not realize how tough that would be. But we ended up starting a new gym. And once it was about a few weeks from coming to fruition, I got a call out of the blue from somebody named Brandon Miller. And Brandon Miller, I had known vaguely because he owns American Top Team Portland. And for those of you who don't know, that's kind of the premier MMA gym, at least on the West Coast. American Top Team has a ton of professional fighters, world level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners, as well as a lot of fighters that are in the UFC even. And there's a Florida location that's a little bit bigger. And then there's a Portland location as well. So he owned that, several other businesses. He's a very successful business person, one of which being a construction company. And he called me out of the blue and just said, "Hey man, so the space right next to American Top Team just opened up for lease. How do you feel about owning a gym with me?" And it's such a bad idea when you've never started a gym to then start 2 gyms simultaneously. Like, dear God, is that a bad idea? And I knew that. And keep in mind, this is recent. This is within a few months ago. And I knew that. But at the same time, my entire life, I've always wanted to have an athlete roster. There's something to this effect. Something to the effect of 20% non-athletes that just want to get bigger, get stronger, whatever. 50% strength athletes and like 30% MMA fighters. But it's hard when you're in the strength world to then convince an MMA fighter to train with you. They tend to see us as unfunctional, big for nothing, strong for nothing kind of people. In fact, there's some natural animosity there at times. But this could be a natural conduit doing so. So I immediately told him, like, hey, here's the problem. I don't have a lot of money right now because I just sunk everything into this gym. And he told me that he owns a construction company. He can do all the refurbishments and the development of the new gym. You know, we made some agreements and it started. We started grinding, started hitting it really hard. And let me tell you, this was a busy few weeks because one gym opened on one Saturday, the other gym opened on the following Saturday. So the last few weeks has been just unbelievably rough. I'm pretty beat down at this point, so I might not be the most articulate today. But with that being said, I mean, there's weeks where, I mean, we would, like for the gym in Vancouver, Sappergenic Strength and Conditioning, we would move all the equipment from storage facilities to the new gym with only us 3 owners and 1 or 2 other people, back-breaking work. If anybody's ever moved horse stall mats, dear God, there's not enough I can get paid to do that. Like that is so tough. So I moved all the equipment there, got everything set up. And then that very night we finished. I went to nationals for 5 days to coach. Every single day I had 3 to 4 athletes per day. I take coaching very seriously. So I do a lot of work. You know, every day would be getting there at 6:37 a.m., handling an athlete all day. And then I'd have an athlete at night that texts me saying, hey, I know I was 2 pounds over. Now I'm 10 pounds over. You fucking, how did you do that? So I'd have to go help them cut weight. And then I'd have to go to, do my normal client work until 2 a.m., then wake up the next day at 6 a.m. So it was 5 days of that shit. It was just miserable. And then the second I get back at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning or something like that. And then I had to be at the gym at 7 a.m., then moving all the rest of the equipment to the other gym. And so the past few weeks, month or so, has been extraordinarily rough. But now both gyms are fully open. They're actually excelling beyond my wildest expectations. The one in Portland, again, is in connection with ATT, which has been excellent. So there's some top level fighters you'll see on in the UFC even walk into my gym, which is incredible. And then the other gym up in Vancouver is also doing extraordinarily well. We have a membership base currently that, again, exceeded my expectations as far as what I thought was feasible at this point in time.
How far are they apart?
They're about 30 minutes apart, okay. 30 to 40 minutes apart. Yeah. Which you would think might create a little bit of awkwardness or competition, but they tend to be completely different populations going to both of them. So it's actually quite nice, but that is kind of where I'm at up to date.
I really like that story because like a lot of people might look at, college, not to be derogatory, but like college dropout guy, public commercial gym for whatever amount of time, then you get to Kabuki and the seminars, and people will look at A and people will look at B and just go, what a meteoric rise, how so lucky, and you're like, actually, if you actually look at the gap between A and B, it's usually a load of fucking donkey work. Like the 2 a.m. going to bed, 6 a.m. starts, not getting paid or getting paid poorly, doing the low-hanging fruit stuff so you can be in the environment to earn the next step and the next step and the next step. And then, when you finally get to B or whatever, then it looks nice and shiny and great. And people always assume it was just this lovely ride to get there, right? But actually, it's just blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah.
Like Dave said, the harder you work, the luckier you tend to get. So like if you hadn't worked hard enough to impress them, it would have been irrelevant, right? But hard work eventually pays off, I like to think. It might not be in the time frame you like, but usually eventually at some point, maybe in an unexpected way. And sometimes like with your second gym, sometimes it is a terrible idea. But sometimes the opportunity is too good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like people said to us, like, for example, why would you move out to Ohio to work for Elite? And I'm like, it's Elite FTS. Like if Dave says jump, you say how high. So I made the example of like, I'm British, I'm sorry. Like if you're a soccer coach and Man United or Real Madrid call you up and say, do you fancy, like we're not going to pay you very much. Do you fancy just coming along and doing some work? You're going to go, yes. You're not going to ask all the minutiae quite. Same with a contract. You would have just gone, all right. You probably would have just skimmed read it. And somewhere it's like, oh, we get to have your kidney or whatever.
Yeah.
You're like, whatever, sign me up. And sometimes you have to do the stuff that really sucks or maybe looks a bit stupid to get the lucky outcome later on that people will just kind of gravitate to and think, oh, well, some people just make it.
I want to go back to the conversation that you had with, did you say his name was George?
The head of coaching at Kabuki?
No, a couple years into college. The guy that's
the advisor.
Yeah.
The advisor.
Robert Campy.
Robert, okay. Do you think, because I've had a similar experience, right? So, and it was a harsh, experience, which led to the same outcome. I went back to college and ended up actually graduating kind of the same way you did. And do you think through that conversation that he actually wanted you to quit, or he just said what you needed to hear to get your ass into gear?
It's so funny you mentioned that. While telling the story, I specifically wanted to mention that to this day, I don't know which one was the case.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked that. So in all honesty, I personally think he truly gave up on me.
Mm-hmm.
But again, great. But there is a chance that he told me that because he knew that's what I needed to hear. And to this day, I really want to reach out to him and ask him.
You should, because it's in the experience that I had, it was a little bit different narrative. It fell more along the lines of, you're not stupid, you're just lazy. Because I grew up with labels of learning disability and tutors and special ed classes and all the other stuff. So I just figured by default, I wasn't smart enough to be able to go through college, even though I tried to go through, but then failed out. And then when I came back and I'm having this conversation with him, there was a real interesting building that I found on college that I never found before. It was called a library. And it was, my girlfriend would be studying, and I don't know how to use the fucking card catalog. I just stumbled across a section of the library that had the NSCA Journal and International Journal of Sport Science and International Journal of Sport Nutrition, the Soviet Sport Review. So I'm up there just fucking taking notes the whole time. I should be studying, right? But I'm just taking notes on all this shit. So I fail out, but then when I go to the weight room and he's in there and I'm talking to him, I just immediately, first off, he asked, so how was school? So I'm not talking about that because I just flunked out, right?
Yeah.
0.75 grade point. I'm kicked out for a semester. Don't think I'm going to go back, and he already knew that, but I'm going into this fucking block periodization shit and all this other kind of stuff into this great detail because he was my wrestling coach. So he also trained, and we would train together every now and again. I'm like, man, this shit is fucking amazing. So I'm going and going and going and going. And then he stops me and says, that's not what I asked. How's school? I flunked out. So maybe I am supposed to just work at the Sunny Delight Orange Juice plant, whatever it's going to be. And that's when he came back out and said, you know what, your background has led you to believe that you're stupid, right? You're just fucking lazy. And that's all it is. You need to work hard. You need to read things 3 or 4 times, to be able to actually retain it, or actually, I learned later, or actually give a shit about the topic, which is, a big thing. And through that conversation with him, and again, I didn't know until I went back to thank him many years later. I didn't know what the true intent was, right? All I knew is after he said that and I was driving home, I couldn't answer the question in my own head. Am I fucking lazy? Because I didn't think I was lazy. I worked hard. You know what I'm saying? And in wrestling, I worked hard. In the weight room, I worked hard. Like, lazy is a word that would piss me off, especially then. Yeah. Like, I can be a lot of other things, but not that, right? And you just said I'm fucking lazy. Like, am I? And so I had to prove that to myself. And then years later, when I went back, and there was another coach as well that for other reasons that taught me how to work hard when I was younger, and just to thank them for that. Because it kind of dawned on me that a lot of coaches that may inspire or motivate us, when we're younger, they don't know that they did. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you kind of think of yourself as a coach now, all coaches are making impacts on people positive and negatively, but not everybody's going to tell you, especially online. You're almost never told. Like, that's why I asked about the in-person to the online, because I've seen the inverse. People go from online to in-person, like, oh my God, people actually like this stuff.
Yeah.
They say thank you, they appreciate it. Where online, you're like, all you see is like the negative shit. And when I went back and spoke to him and thanked him about that, and it was a little risky in my own head, to play this out, because in a way he's kind of a hero. And the worst thing you ever want to do, right, mm-hmm. is to meet your heroes because they become real. And it's like, I kind of like how I think about this guy, And then when I went back to thank him, then to talk this all through, as it turned out, he grew up the same way, and realized that he just had to work harder and study harder and be able to do that. And so he saw that in me and did not want to see that same path go through with that. So I would say it would be worth going back, just because either way, he had this great positive impact. Because had you quit, I'm not going to say you'd still be roofing, because that sucks. I mean, anybody that does that, outside of a very few, usually transition into something else because it's fucking terrible. To be able to see with that. But to go back to the going from the in-person to the online, you do lose that aspect. Like if it's in person, it's Gen Pop. There's a lot of negatives with it. I did it for 8 years. I mean, we've all kind of done it. I've done it for a long time. There's a lot of things that just kind of suck about it. It's boring as hell for one. I mean, there's a lot of things that just suck. I watched a lot of Sports Center, because it was, on the TV, but the accolades are high. You almost take it for granted. Thank you and all this other kind of stuff. And then when you're online, it flips, right? And I've told this story about Wendler multiple times. He was in assistant strength coach, so seeing that, and then pretty much all the stuff he was doing online. And there's and you're kind of early in the Kabuki type of thing. There's certain growth periods to where the criticism is going to be higher than anything that's positive, but you lose touch a little bit with the impact that you're having when it's all online. But then now that you kind of go back to it, well, you're doing seminars too, so that kind of can balance it out a little bit. But when you're used to that, then you go online and forget about the Excel sheets and all the other kind of stuff. With that being taken away, did you start to think that is this even making a difference at all?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I had none of these. Because here's the thing, soft skills of coaching are very much underappreciated. I would argue that they're extraordinarily important, but they actually vary a little bit as far as coaching versus in person versus virtually. And there's some serious skill sets you have to develop to really effectively do it online. You have to reach out constantly. You have to be on phone calls. You have to be on Zoom recordings. You have to do things online right. There's a lot of time that goes into it. And to the point you made earlier, if you really calculate the money you make per hour as an online coach, you probably shouldn't, because it's pretty depressing. Yeah. It's a lot of time that goes into it. So yeah, when I first started doing coaching online, to your point, like I just didn't know if I was helping people, if I was hurting people. I didn't know how to get them to respond to me in the way I needed. I didn't know how to get the information out of them that I needed. I didn't know how to keep them, to actually keep them on track in a sense, to keep them accountable. It's a different skill set to actually do it. So to your point, yeah, when I first started online, one of the big things I struggle with is it's wonderful to work someone with in person and then immediately see those changes. But when you do so online, you may not see them at all if you don't have the systems created to do so, or you see them a week later. So it's a little less rewarding, or it feels like it in the short term at least. It's a lot harder. There's some different skill sets involved. But that's definitely the feeling I had at first, where I was just like, man, am I meant for online coaching? Like, was I better off in person? Do I like this as much? Because the thing is, the most miserable thought in the world to me is doing something full time for the rest of your life that you don't love. And until I realized my path in college, what I wanted to do, I couldn't pay attention in class to save my life. And that's why I always tell college kids, like, dude, if you don't know what you want to do, probably don't go to college yet. Yeah. There's a certain amount of drive that comes with what you want to do with that degree if you know it. But all of this to say, though, that, it took a while to adapt to it. It took a lot of skill set building, but that's the exact feeling I had at first, is like, do I even like this? Is this a style of coaching that matches me? Or do I even have the natural skill sets involved with excelling in this domain?
Do you think that is why you can make the argument of starting with personal coaching? And for a couple of reasons. So first off, if you've got 5 years of working with people in person and having success, there's a certain level of self-confidence that will come from that. Like, your processes work. Maybe not without fail, but there's a success rate there that you know of, and you have evidence to back up. So when you hear nothing, your first thought might not be failure. It might be, I get 80 to 90% results. So there's an 80 to 90% chance with no feedback, good things are probably happening. But then also, if you're going to have less communication online, it's more important you know what questions to ask. So if you've been working with people in person and having those hour-long conversations, you know which questions land and which ones get you into the information. Sometimes the question that you need to ask is not how does the squat feel today, is how's work been? Because they have a really stressful, and all of that comes into the gym with them, right? So you start to learn which questions actually unlock the information, because clients will try, but they don't really know what information you need most of the time. You can build that up over time, of course, but if you have that background, then if you only get to have a certain amount of verbiage and communication per week, you're probably more efficient. asking the questions that actually get you what you want. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah. Yeah, I firmly believe that somebody should start in person. And that's actually a mistake I see a lot of coaches that want to coach online eventually end up making is they're like, commercial fitness? I'm too good for that. That's kind of the general attitude. And I always say that commercial fitness, a great place to start, terrible place to end for most people, right? It's tough, but dear God, did I learn so much doing that. I learned an incredible amount doing it. I would not replace that experience with anything else. The populations you work with, you get to see how to get people to work hard, what systems people respond best to, what exercise selection you should stick with, like what people's common faults are, and what population you should lean into because you enjoy training with them the most. There's so many different foundations or skill sets that you learn through doing that. And an ideal world, in my opinion, if somebody wants to eventually be an online coach, it should be a slow linear increase as far as how many people they work with are online. It shouldn't start off like how I started off with, kind of trial by fire, all in person, all online. That's tough. That's really tough. Ideally, someone would have a hard bias towards in person, and then eventually they start to get a few online clients. That slowly ramps up over time. And the cherry on top is having somebody that's a successful online coach mentor you. That is unbelievably helpful. Because there's a lot of like a lot of nuances of doing it that are rather hard to learn on your own, and you don't want to learn those while taking in somebody else's money. You want to have somebody kind of guide you along, show you, what the best practices are as far as getting the feedback you need, setting up the systems involved to make sure you're consistently communicating. But also showing somebody you care online is rather hard. And one of the sayings I absolutely love, I don't know who it's by, but something to the effect of, your client doesn't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That is something that's unbelievably undervalued in the industry. Is so many coaches will have an immense knowledge base in everything training, and they put together these evidence-based, really particular programs, but their athlete just feels like they don't give a shit about them. And they sit here saying like, I don't know why they're just not working hard enough and not giving me the feedback I need. If they felt you care, that probably will change quite a bit. But to that topic of making sure they know you care, they know you're bought in, they know you want to see them succeed. Driving that is a lot easier in person. It's rather daunting virtually, and it takes some time to get to.
Sure. But that goes to emphasize that the coaching relationship is more of a two-way thing than people think, perhaps. It's not you give me money, I give you service. It's a two-way relationship where, okay, like I just mentioned, most clients don't know the information you need, but is it not my responsibility to help teach you the information that I need so that I can coach you better? The onus is also on you to create good habits for them in terms of creating a better relationship from both ends of the spectrum. And again, I think that you would probably put that under the umbrella of soft skills, like educate your client. You don't lose clients by educating them, by keeping them in the dark. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, if I tell them the reasoning behind this training block, they're going to know all my super secrets, and now they're not going to need a class. Yeah, but people do think about that sometimes. Right? It's like, no, that's not going to happen. They're either asking because they're keen to learn and they probably coach themselves, or they're just invested enough in the process that they want to know the why. And, sometimes it's really easy to suffer when you know the why. That's important too, So again, coaches can make clients better clients, and then conversely, clients can make coaches better coaches. And I think what you alluded to there with starting in a commercial setting and almost dealing with the broadest possible spectrum of clients is probably the best thing you can do, because working with people with double hip replacements and stuff teaches you things. It's like not necessarily directly the hip replacement, but how do I create a progression system that gets them back to where they were? Maybe you have to figure it out as you go, but they're probably as open to that as you are. It's not like you're dealing with an NFL athlete coming from a surgery who's got 6 weeks to be ready. You know what I mean? They've got time, and you're going to encounter so many different problems than if you go narrow early and you just deal with a small subset of problems.
Well, you're also working with a very diverse demographic there. Not only a diverse demographic, but a diverse demographic to where training probably isn't a high priority for them. They're doing it because their doctor told them to, or whatever it's going to be. And so now you have to learn how to communicate, with all that, to where if all you've ever worked with were competitive powerlifters, that's a diverse demographic, but not like that. And that people are still people, right? So those Gen Pop people may have the same type of personality set as what that power lifter may have, and it'd be just as diverse, but you're able to learn that with Gen Pop, which you have a larger degree of error, with that. Cause if their machine press goes up by a plate in 2 weeks, they probably really don't care that. I mean, they do, but not to the degree of what the other would. And a lot of the times, as you've both kind of said, that the ability to communicate what you want them to do is going to supersede what you're actually having them do.
Yeah. And two things to say on what you said just there. For one, online coaching is by no means for everybody. Like, dear, you have to have a certain amount of skill sets and buy-ins to actually do it. And I think that more coaches should probably turn people away when they reach out to them wanting coaching. Because I had someone just recently that was like, all right, I really want online coaching for you. I've been following you for years. Want to do this, want to do that. Here's my goals. And as I'm explaining along the process, like, ooh, I don't know if I'm going to take videos. Ooh, putting in my loads on a spreadsheet. Like, I'm not sure if I can adhere to that. I'm like, all right, great. That's awesome. So it sounds like what you need. It's just a personal trainer. I have a great network. Tell me where you live, and I'll send someone your way, because I don't want to coach them and struggle through that. And if they're resistant to it at the very start and they refuse to, then online coaching simply isn't for them. And a lot of coaches want to take their money, and then that's oftentimes why they don't have the best retention. But yeah, just to say that online coaching is by no means for everybody. A lot of people just need that in-person touch. But second off, one of the biggest red flags for me when I hear coaches talk is when coaches consistently talk about how none of their clients work hard. Like, oh man, you should see this one guy work that he just refuses to work hard. He refuses to do this, to do that. Like, and oftentimes they'll throw around the word entitled, like, oh, they're just so entitled these days, and all this other stuff.
That's a little fucked up just listening to you two explain that, because what they're actually saying and describing is them being entitled.
That's where I was going. It drives me crazy. Yeah, because that's what I was saying. Because exactly. First off, it's the onus on you to teach them how to do those things. The onus is on you. But take a step further, and this is the case with a lot of terms, the people that complain about something the most oftentimes are the most guilty of it. It's almost like the classic example of somebody that constantly bitches about not liking drama. Oftentimes they're the drama starter. It's the same thing. The people that constantly bitch about how everyone else is entitled, and you have them explain why they think someone's entitled. And under the example of coach, it's like, no, you're the entitled one. You're just demanding they do all this stuff without putting any time to educate them. Explain the why. You yourself are what you're accusing them of being. So it's such a big red flag to me. If none of your athletes are working hard online, that really says more about you than anything.
In your experience, the coaches who are making those complaints, are they quite often the ones who are using templates and cookie cutter programs? That
is the most common. They often use the templates. They don't hop on the phone. They don't explain the why. They don't really do video review, things of that nature.
So at no point have they probably sat down and just said, what do you like doing? What do you enjoy working? I think it's in one of Dan John's books where, like, he says sometimes people look at him like he's a genius when he'll have a client or whatever, and he's like, well, what do you want to achieve? They're like, I really want to get my squat up. He's like, do you like squatting? Yeah. Have you ever tried squatting a couple of times a week? Yeah, I respond pretty well to it. All right, well, why don't we do like a 6-month training cycle where we'll up your squatting frequency from 1 to 2 to 3 times a week? We'll put it all together, and then they look at him like he's enlightened them. And he's like, all I did was just ask you what you like and write a program that you want to do. So like in that scenario, has the coach just gone, okay, they want to lose fat. Here's my fat loss program. Oh, you hate all the things that are in it? Well, motivation matters.
Yeah, or they create the goals for the client. Yes. That's really common. Like as a coach, your job is to get them to their goals. Your job is not create goals for them. And so many coaches make that mistake where a lot of powerlifting coaches, for example, will just like people that aren't remotely interested in powerlifting. They just want to lose fat. They want to do this, whatever. They're like, all right, well, too bad. Suck. You are powerlifting. But whatever the case may be, like they force goals down their throat and then find it unbelievable when they're not working hard towards those goals they never had. So yeah, that's extraordinarily common. And another thing worth noting there is coaches tend to what was I going to say there? Yeah, it's just very common for them to make goals for them.
Like reflect their own biases on
exactly, reflect their own biases towards them, and then just be baffled when they're not bought into those imaginary goals.
No, everything that we've spoken about this coaching, we can flip it just a little bit inversely for those people that are looking for a coach to be able to use everything that we've just said to be able to help vet them into who's going to be a good coach and who's not. Right. Yeah. So it's, I don't want the people that are listening thinking, because if they are coaches, all this is great. This all helps them tremendously, but it's also the red flags that if you're the client looking for a coach will stand out really quick. What were some topics that you threw down?
I just want to have one more on that. I'm sorry, in that this is for coaches now. Yeah. You mentioned them being like, oh, commercial gym, like below me, what? But like, how many of the top, let's say like you've had exposure to these top MMA guys, right? How many of them really love weightlifting?
Practically none. They see it as a waste of time.
Right. So what you're dealing with is, if we say, let's take those MMA fighters as a population, you're dealing with a population that are only training because they feel like they have to. They have a lot of prerequisites in their life that takes up a lot of time and stress. Okay, how is that any different to coaching someone with 2 kids and a 9 till 5? The problems are just different. And the performance level we would hope is probably higher, but your goal is still to get someone who probably doesn't love training to do the things they need to do to get better. And even in every scenario, whether it's the recreational powerlifter who's willing to die under the bar and has no problem with motivation, the job is still the same. Usually it's making them do the stuff they probably don't want to do with the correct mix of the stuff they like doing. The skill set is almost the same.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So they have this false preconception. It's like, oh, when I coach athletes, I'll have this free reign to just do all this cool shit, all this incredible programming, show how good I really. It's like, no. If you can get them in the gym twice a week and keep them pieced together, you're doing your job.
Yeah, the number one goal
is not exciting.
Truly adherence. And that's one of the things that I'm really big on as a coach is my intake. A large part of my client intake form is simply figuring out what the hell they like. And also take a step further. One thing I do quite often that I don't see a lot of people do, and I've even got judged for a little bit in the past, is oftentimes I'll write in slots in training where it's something to the effect of any horizontal row variation, any bicep variation, which is not super common, but oftentimes I do that for one, because it increases training enjoyment, and training enjoyment is such an important factor that people oftentimes overlook. But take a step further, you oftentimes learn a lot from what they pick. It's a great learning experience as an actual coach. But one other thing to say on that previous comment you made about being too good for starting a commercial gym, that is really common, really common. And one of the things that I think I was really good at in the beginning with the story I just told, going to Kabuki, being okay with not getting paid anything. People talk, and I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this. It can come off really bad and really condescending, but I'm going to try to say it in a nice way. People talk about a lot knowing your worth. Like, knowing your worth is so important. You got to know your worth. And this specifically is in regards to actual career development. If it's said in terms of like a relationship, like, yeah, absolutely. That's not what I'm talking about whatsoever. But it's always said in regards to know your worth more. I think more often than not, people need to know the opposite. They need to know at that point in their career, they're not actually worth a lot. And that's okay. That's perfectly okay.
The way I would define that is, outside of the personal relationship that you're talking about, is just change the way that question is to what is your market value? Right? Because there's a big discrepancy between worth and market value. It's the online coach. I'm worth $300 an hour. Okay, cool. What is that in the real market? Because it's the real world. You got other people to compete with. So what is your market value? Right? Well, it's not going to be that, maybe, but it's probably not going to be that. Right? So if you want that worth, find a different career. Right?
Absolutely.
Because there's the reality of all that. So I feel the same that you do when I see that being thrown out. Like, well, know your worth. I'm like, actually, know your market value and know your replacement value.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And
then build that. Right. And you build that with skill sets and so forth. To increase that.
And that's the thing that I think a lot of, like, for example, people I graduated with, and not mean this in a bad way, but oftentimes they're in the exact same place they were because they knew their worth and thought their market value was a lot higher than it actually was. When we were at the same point when we were graduating, I knew I wasn't worth jack shit.
Yeah.
I knew my market value was very, very low. So I was willing to work places for free, to do an internship where I didn't get paid shit, and to do a lot of things like that allowed me to eventually have my worth be pretty good, to have my market value be pretty good. But if you think you're worth exponentially more than you actually are, that's one of the greatest conduits to not progressing a whole lot in your career.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to pretext this with, this is probably going to get a little bit nerdy for my own benefit. I'm sorry. Hopefully not too nerdy. But the first topic I want to touch on, because I think it gets overlooked and it probably carries over to everything, which is what I'm going to try and cover with all these topics. But foot mechanics and rooting. Foot mechanics is a fancy term, I know, but let's just go with rooting, how you use your feet when you lift, right? Everyone in the world asks the question of what's the best squat stance? How wide should my grip width be on bench? Should I deadlift sumo? No one ever addresses the fact that most people are walking around on breeze blocks, basically, with no force transfer, no stability, probably a much higher risk of knee, hip, back issues stemming, up the chain. So what are some things that people should be looking? So let's first off, how do we know we have a rooting problem? Because like if you look at the average person's foot, there's usually quite a lot going wrong. So without kind of getting too nerdy on that, what would you kind of say for people to look at in terms of like maybe the footwear choice and what their feet are like in a regular kind of barefoot scenario? What are we looking for to see if we have dysfunction?
Yeah, really good question. So first off, I'm going to come off as a bit of a hippie in this regard, but luckily it's becoming more and more mainstream, where I am a big believer in minimalist style shoes. I really am. I'll just be honest. It's a hard bias of mine, but the simple reason why is because, man, have I made massive improvements through making that transition myself, and through working with a lot of very good clinicians, I've started to understand the why behind it a little bit better. But at the same time, a lot of lifters are kind of dead upon arrival within their ability to have really good connection with the floor and great upstream function, simply due to the fact that, as you said, they're squatting on Brillo pads in a sense. They're squatting in running shoes or whatever the case may be. That's more geared towards Gen Pop and people of that nature. But at the same time, as far as assessing it goes, I think it always starts first with a barefoot squat assessment. That's something that's not done nearly enough. And upon looking at that, you can then get the needed framework or the needed information to develop a framework to actually improving it. It all starts with an assessment and needs analysis and then going from there. And oftentimes when we start with the barefoot squat, we get some fantastic information. So for example, we see knee cave in the squat, and that's a great topic we'll have to get into here a little bit more later on, but we see horrendous knee cave in the squat. We ask the question, why is that happening? Is it because they have not so balanced muscle co-contractions upstream? Is it because of a foot ankle issue? Is it because of a trunk stability issue? What exactly is it? But upon seeing them squat barefoot, we get a lot of great information. Are they slipping into pronation, supination, shifting to the toes, shifting to the heels? Maybe it's as simple as their squat stance isn't ideal for their hip morphology and structure. Oftentimes that's the case as well. But very often when you see somebody squat barefoot, you can very clearly identify the fact that they aren't stacking the ankle very well. They have no idea how to splay and really use the intrinsic muscles within the foot to connect to the floor really well. And oftentimes they end up thinking they're doing that, but they just crunch the toes, decrease their surface area contact, and actually make it exponentially worse. And then all of a sudden we tend to see pronation of foot or just caving in, and upstream downregulation, force production, stability, motor control, which then results oftentimes in knee cave. And then we have to ask the question, well, if that's the case, well, then maybe putting a band around the knees isn't the best solution for them specifically. Not to say that's inherently bad by any means, but oftentimes the knee caves simply due to something that's happening at the foot ankle complex. The reference I always like to use is when somebody has knee cave, it's typically due to, if it's a technique issue, it's typically due to one of two things. It's either the foot ankle complex or the hip trunk complex. That's typically the two places to go when that happens, assuming it's a technique issue. And the way I like to think about it is the knee is like a conduit of communication between the foot ankle and the hip. It doesn't think for itself. It doesn't do for itself. Another reference I love to use that I'm proud to say I made myself is the knee is kind of like a private in a stereotypical military movie, right? The private doesn't think for himself. He doesn't do for himself. He only does what his commanders tell him to do. Well, the commanders in this scenario is the foot ankle and the trunk hip. And if we can do a barefoot squat and identify that they're having pronation of the foot, poor motor control of their toes, splaying, gripping, whatever the case may be, and we see knee cave with it to a point where it's making them collapse in really hard, then we know that improving their foot function will then lead to better stacking upstream, better force production with it, and a more successful squat. So long-winded answer is that when we are looking at rooting, the first place I like to go is a barefoot squat. Another good analysis is a split squat. Another good analysis is actually looking at how their foot is structured. Oftentimes that gives us a lot of great information. So for example, the vast majority of time, not every time, but the vast majority of time, when somebody has very flat feet, they're going to have a much higher tendency to bias towards, when rooting's not great, bias towards pronation or collapsing in. When somebody has a very high arch, then they typically bias towards supination, shifting to the heels, things like that. So even looking at foot structure itself can kind of give us an idea or indicator of what we're more likely to suffer from when rooting is not up to par.
Would you say that toe structure comes into that as well? So what I'm saying is someone who's constantly wearing sneakers and narrow shoes, and their toes are all angled, like little toe and big toe are angled inwards, like so. Is that something that's worth addressing for most people? Because obviously, if you're naturally curved and angled in, your ability to reach out is going to be significantly less, I would presume.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't want to go into too long of an answer here, but I want to kind of describe what happened to me when I first got to Kabuki, because that was exactly me. I have notoriously flat Flintstone feet. I have feet that have been constantly stuck in shoes that are very, very narrow. And if you were to rewind and look at my foot like 6 years ago, it's exactly the structure you're describing. They were practically glued together. My pinky toe was slightly stacked on top of the toe next to it. And if you asked me to splay my toes, lift my toes, move one individually, I couldn't do any of that. I couldn't even splay. I had zero control over them individually. And then you're going to ask me to then have a good connection with the floor. Good luck. It's going to be very, very rough. So the first transition I made is simply training barefoot or in minimalist style shoes. And immediately I had some improvements, though some of the musculature near there got very beat up, because as it turns out, when you go with shoes like that or go barefoot, you end up asking a lot more from your body as far as the foot ankle complex goes. But then I ran into an issue where it didn't really change as much as I thought it should. So then I realized, okay, well, if I train 2 hours a day, wear shoes the entire day, I walk around throughout the entire day. If I wear the right shoes or no shoes during squat session, and then immediately go back into these thick ass tennis shoes that take my foot and crunch it up into a balled up fist, maybe that's also causing an issue. So then I bias towards slowly ramping up, keyword is slow, wearing them in my everyday life as well. And that's when something really cool happened, where my foot structure quite literally changed shape. My resting state was a lot less stuck together. My pinky toe started to come out from over the top of the toe next to it. My motor control, I started being able to splay a little bit better, grip a little bit better, balance a little bit better. A lot of cool things happened simply from that. And then from time or over time, also through some drills, I was able to actually demonstrate really good competency within splaying, gripping without crunching, and having some great function within the foot from it. But one thing to reiterate there, because a lot of people will hear something like this and go, oh, say less. And they go minimal style from 0 to 100 like that. Shoe companies have been sued over claims around that. So here's the thing. It's kind of like wanting to bench press 500 pounds. You don't go straight to 500. There's a slow ramping up process. And when you go from something that constricts it so much to something that requires it to work naturally and work a lot harder, there has to be kind of some graded exposure to doing so. You have to slowly ramp it up. So for me personally, for example, I started with just my squat sessions, then my training sessions, then a few hours a day, then most hours a day, and eventually all throughout my day. And even through that time, it got quite sore along the time frame, but it never exceeded in a soreness level where injury was likely to occur.
What kind of soreness in what areas are we so like if someone goes and does this now, what are we expecting? Even if they do it right, what kind of soreness are we expecting to run into?
Mainly it was the soleus, the gastroc, some muscles around the ankle and calf definitely got a little bit beat up. But mainly it was muscles I've never felt before. So small little intrinsic muscles in the foot that honestly barely anybody knows the name of, myself included. They're pretty lengthy names for each individual one. But it just basically felt like the bottom of my foot especially was kind of cramping every time I overdid it a little bit. Every time I overdid it, it just felt like the bottom of my foot was cramping, almost like I was dehydrated. I had one of those classic cramps, but it was like that constantly. And that was a good indicator to dial it back a little bit. But mainly it's muscles of that nature.
Sure. So like for the average lifter who's listening now, to try and maybe convince them that this is important, right? Like when you squat and deadlift, it's obvious. The foot is the conduit to force transfer through the floor. Even on bench, what are you using to maintain your leg drive, your setup, military press, whatever else? So I think it was it Fred Hatfield said the quote, like, you can't fire a cannon from a canoe. So if you're standing on unstable feet, that's probably what you're trying to do. So hoping we've got some kind of buy-in now. Let's say I am that lifter with that crappy foot structure. What do I do other than, you've mentioned the footwear process, that's great, but is there anything outside of that actively that we can look to do to improve that, not just the actual structure of the foot, but the ability to splay and grab, the ability to have stronger connection, all those types of things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one of the things that I really like that has an unfortunate name, especially because there's anyways, is a foot love drill. Foot love drills are fantastic. So pretend these are my toes, fingers in between them, and simply roll it out. That's weirdly an effective start. Like it doesn't seem like it would work, but it works rather well actually to simply start like that. And then all of a sudden, when you take your hand out from under it, they splay a little bit more naturally. They splay a little bit easier. So starting off with something as simple as that prior to your drills can be really helpful. So starting off with that, and then going through drills where we just focus on splaying, relaxing, splaying, relaxing. Something as simple as that is really helpful. Then over time, we can start to work on, let's see if we can get the big toe individually to move on its own. Yeah, we can't. Okay. And there's a wall stretch drill that I really like, where you basically take an acu ball, a wall, a rack, whatever, and you put your big toe up against it and it's stretching. And then eventually you take it away and see if you can hold it up there yourself. You do that a few times, and all of a sudden you can lift up from the start. That was a transition I've seen with myself and other people, and you can do that with individual toes as well. With that being said, it's usually drills like that are very effective, but take a step further, other drills that really balance your ability to utilize that structure under loading conditions. So one great example that everybody knows of, though dear God, does it perform poorly most of the time, is hip airplanes. Things like that integrate the entire system is really fantastic. You're pushing external rotation, internal rotation, bracing, keeping the ribcage and pelvis stacked while rooting to the floor. And you can kind of give yourself somewhat of a graded exposure where you start with lightly grabbing a rack, then a PVC pipe, then grabbing nothing, something like that. But the hip airplanes is a great start to do it in a more functional manner, I guess you could say. And then we can start to add some load with some KB passes. That's an excellent exercise, really good one for warming up.
Is that where you stand on one leg and you would pass it from side to side?
Exactly. Think of almost like a single leg RDL at the start. You start to hinge, have the weight balanced over the foot, and then you stop roughly 1/4 of the way through a single leg RDL, hold that position, and then take a kettlebell and pass it back and forth. And you'll notice after a few reps, every muscle in there is just screaming at you. And drills like that are really fantastic as well. And then we could start to transition towards things that are a little bit more heavier loaded, maybe a single leg landmine squat or things of that nature that challenge it a whole lot, or single leg RDL. You can go cross body variations. The exercise selection depends on the individual and the goal, but that's the somewhat steady ramp up process that I would suggest. But it does typically start with, in my opinion at least, simply changing your footwear, because there's a lot of research that shows us that in itself tends to cause some fantastic benefits. One of which that I experienced was seeing my foot go through hypertrophy, which, let me tell you, is kind of creepy. I mean, you're seeing your foot get like exponentially thicker was a very weird thing. Yeah, very weird.
So the kind of general trend I'm seeing there with the drills you're recommending is it's generally going to be single leg, single foot, and it involves increasing degrees of compensating for some kind of altering balance point.
Absolutely. Controlling center of mass through challenging the foot in a more and more drastic manner while increasing load and specificity.
So like goal. For someone who's at home and maybe doesn't know what to do, they can just think of it in their head, right? How do I create some instability in this position and then create a little bit more? Yeah,
I've even seen some like athletic development coaches even do like med ball tosses while on a single leg while doing that barefoot. That can be effective as well.
Okay.
So what if their starting point is more regressed? In other words, they're using insoles. They're
good question.
Their chiropractor or whoever, said, here's what you need to do. So they're always in insoles 24/7. Well, not, every time they're awake, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because there's some issues that can arise from that. Right.
Yeah.
But to your point, what I've seen with people in those situations is they go from 0 to 100. Then they wonder why their plantar fasciitis is flaring up through the roof. Right. Yeah. So with them, what would be the first recommendation?
Yeah. So for me personally, if it is coming from a clinician, that ends up being a pretty hard spot for a coach.
Yes,
a really
very
hard
hard.
spot. I mean,
Very hard.
To say it's an uphill battle is a understatement.
Yeah.
So what I typically like to do with an individual like that is I have to put my...
Well, let's assume, let's just protect all of our asses here. Let's assume that there's compliance through that. Like the clinician is like, we need to get this person out of here just so they can have that force not be shifted into their hip or knee or so forth, because isn't that kind of what's going on?
Exactly. Yeah. And where I was going there is actually having a clinician in your network that can explain the nuances, talk to them, still help them through their foot issues, while you can kind of take a backward step and let the individual with a higher degree and kind of appeal to authority kind of walk them through that in a little bit more careful manner. Because I've seen the industry largely shift away from entirely using insoles, using arch support and things like that. And for very good reason. With emerging evidence, it tends to show that in most cases, they probably shouldn't be used. And at one point in time, they were very overprescribed. And I was one of those individuals. I was told to be in arch, arch support for quite some time. And didn't really help much of anything. So I'm a good example for this. When I first started going flat foot, you want to talk about plantar fasciitis. You want to talk about bottom of your foot cramping up. It was tough. It was really tough. So what I ended up doing was in that gradual exposure, I still wore those for all my work jobs. While I was roofing, for example, I still wore them. So there's some individuals that, for reasons that I am not specialized in well enough to articulate, they may be somebody that still needs to have some existence of those. The gradual increase may have to be a little bit slower, but you also may need to have always a setting in your life, especially one that you walk around a lot, where you still include those in some degree. And typically in situations like that, I suggest they see a clinician in my network that has a profound understanding of that and can articulate it to them.
Yeah,
sure. So assuming we've got good foot ability, what does a good root look like? And is it going to be lift dependent? Or is it the same principle throughout? Oh,
that's a really good question. I don't think I've been asked the one where it's, is it the same across the board? That's interesting. Though I may change my mind later down the road, I believe that it would be the same throughout, at least in the way I coach it certainly is. But the way in which I like to cue it is, and there's a lot of cues you can use for this, is simply starting. So for example, if we unrack, walk out of squat, get into our squat position, I'm a big fan of a cadence of cues. Cadence of cues really sets an athlete off in the right direction as far as consistency and execution. I'm a big fan of that. But when that lifter is going through their cadence, I like to start with a splay. And the best cue I found personally is the short foot cue. And typically what that looks like is, especially for someone that's flat-footed, typically that cue is a little bit more needed, is their arch, like they go from flat-footed, for example, if you look at my foot do it, it goes from flat foot to creating a little bit of arch without actually seeing any toe crunch. And that's the big fault that so many people struggle with, which is why a lot of cues such as eagle claw has kind of largely been moved away from, though cues are highly individual. You may tell somebody that it drives the perfect effect. But that's why it's largely been avoided, because oftentimes with cues like that, it causes crunching. So oftentimes it's starting with a splay before we squat, splay, and then we go short foot, or we use something that uses those intrinsic muscles to kind of suction cup. I really like that cue. Suction cup to the floor without having the toes actually crunch. We maintain the splay. We maintain that wide base of support within the foot.
Yeah. So in a meathead sense, we're trying to contract the arch of the foot.
That's a great way of putting
I suppose, right? Shorten, stiffen, tighten, etc. And then the toes, we want the biggest surface area possible.
That's my hard bias. Yeah. In fact, flexion within the toes typically tells me that they need to work on the contraction within the actual foot a lot more, because their body just does not know how to distinguish those two things.
Sure. And you mentioned right at the beginning, the last question related to this topic, you have a bias towards minimalistic shoes, etc. Is that even above barefoot?
Oh, that's a
or
really
if someone
question.
is in a training environment, say like maybe the gym you've got next to the MMA gym, I'm not sure what your policies are, but some gyms are okay with it, right? Training barefoot. Should I favor that if I have the ability to train barefoot?
That's a really good question. But to preface that, even the reason why I'm sometimes a little bit timid of saying that is because there's always at least one individual that reaches out and says, but XYZ lifter squatted this in this shoe wear, and this is what happened, which I totally understand. To be very clear, I am sure as shit not saying you can't be strong in Chuck's, Converse, whatever the case may be. I'm not saying that whatsoever. Some of the strongest athletes in the world, people way stronger than me, have executed massive lifts, credit to them. It's just that, things change over time. time, and I have found that to be more effective. And the same thing goes with any sport. In the early days of every sport, the equipment they had at the time worked effectively well, but things change over time. So that's why I always kind of preface with that statement. But as far as barefoot goes, if they allowed it in competition, that would probably be my bias, period, to be honest. And typically what I like to have the athlete do is in the initial phase of starting to shift over to this, squat 100% barefoot if it's available. If it's not available, then we do the next best thing, which can be a myriad of different shoes. For example, there's some slippers that are pretty good as well, but the important caveat there is just because a shoe is labeled minimalist does not mean it's minimalist. There's some minimalist style shoes out there that have such a narrow toe box, it stacks my toes on top of each other and is the furthest thing from ideal in my perspective. So minimalist can look a little bit different to each person based on structure, but furthermore, just because it's marketed as minimalist doesn't mean it actually is. And the three main requirements we're looking for with a shoe is 1, a wide enough toe box to actually splay effectively, 2, flat to the floor, and 3, minimal material separating your foot from the floor, because the more material you have, typically it degrades proprioception and connection with the floor, especially if it's softer material.
Sure. The way I've kind of worded it, and you may or may not agree with this, is that let's say we could train barefoot as much as possible. We create the strongest possible ability to root through our barefoot and put force down through the floor. Now, let's say in theory, it's an advantage to wear a barefoot shoe that has like a rubberized sole that allows us to create an artificial amount of traction, torque, whatever you want to call it, or an Olympic lifting shoe that has a super hard sole that we can push force through more effectively. Isn't that almost then like an ace card? Like if that were to be the case, if I train barefoot most of the time, the better I use my feet, the better I can use the shoe.
Oh, no, I can definitely agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of Olympic lifting shoes, that's another really interesting conversation too, because a lot of people, when we talk about this, they bring up that as kind of like, oh, well, this lifter did that, this lifter did that while wearing those. And it's kind of an awkward part to add to the conversation, but there's certainly advantages to that too. And for the longest time, Olympic lifting shoes were designed terribly, absolutely terribly. They didn't fulfill any of those requirements whatsoever. But now they're getting designed in a more and more advantageous nature where they have a pretty wide toe box. But when it comes to Olympic lifting shoes, there's definitely certain lifters out there that find it very advantageous for competition. They can typically stay a little bit more upright, hit depth easier, use their knee extensors more effectively. If they have some kind of back pain or injury, oftentimes it puts a little less strain on it. There's a myriad of different case examples for using those, and some people hit their best loads with them. But even a lot of lifters out there that use Olympic lifting for their heavier squats still will go barefoot or in minimal style shoes outside of it.
Sure, because I suppose you could become dependent on the heel elevation and the advantages it gives you. Sure.
Now, one thing I want to say that before we segue into the next comment is you kind of touched on it, that because you asked about exercise specific, is when they're working on trying to develop that rooting, it shouldn't just be on their top sets of squats or their top sets of bench. It should be on every movement they do. If they're doing, I joke around with the people like I did yesterday, like if you're doing a seated machine chest press, root your feet. Everything that you're doing, do it. Because if you're doing 5, 6 exercises per day in the gym and there's a few sets per exercises, you have the opportunity to reinforce that. Same thing you're trying to do in the squat every time you're in a standing position. Right, that's going to expedite the process of you being able to build that neural, connection with that whole thing, and make it stronger faster. Because when you get to some of the more complex things like the airplanes and stuff like that, you're not going to start people with that. They're going to have to develop that capacity, but that capacity could be kind of hacked if they're trying to do this with everything that they do when they're in the gym. So I assume you guys would agree.
No, sure. Yeah, I think the thing that gets not talked about, and we're talking marginal gains here, but if you're going to lift, why not lift as well as you can? I can't remember the name of the phenomena. You may be better versed in this than I do, but the more muscles you have contracting hard at the same time, the higher your level of nervous system activation will go. In the same way that, like, you try doing a set of cable curls where you cup the bar, as in just let it sit, and then grip it as hard as humanly possible, or tricep extensions where they play no role at all. The same can be said for your foot and your calf. If all of those are rooting harder, your nervous system is a higher level of activate. Your body is like, oh, something serious is going down here type thing. So you can, if that in theory could buy you an extra half rep or 2 pounds or whatever on the lift you're doing, then why not? It's effort, unfortunately.
Yeah.
but then we build subconscious habits that then it's not effort when we've done it for long enough.
Yeah, that neural drive increase is actually huge. And funny enough, I had to relearn that the other day in the silliest fashion possible, where I'll be honest, hindsight 2020, I was kind of half-assing the hack squat a little bit. I really was. I was getting towards the end of my like 12, 15 rep set, whatever. And I got to like rep 10. I'm like shaking. I didn't think I was going to get the next rep. I'm like, oh shit. Okay, this isn't good. All right, next one, I'm going to do perfect. And all I did was simply engage lats, squeeze the handles. Did like 10 more. Like I was like, oh shit. This also applies for simple assistance exercises. So it's amazing how little things like that can be such a profound difference, even outside of the big three, which lifters are so guilty of only applying these principles for the big three.
And again, that then goes down around the conversation we always have to have conversation like, how do you define RPE and effort? Because if you're nearly failing because you kind of like sat in it like a lounger, and all of a sudden you grip and pull in like you're holding on for dear life, and all of a sudden you get to 10 more, it's like, well, was I at a 4?
Yeah.
Was I actually at a 4, or was that an 8? Really? Was it in terms of muscular recruitment? And then you're like, oh fuck.
Yeah, I might need to bring Mike T in here and ask him those questions. That'll be an interesting discussion.
All right, I need to use the restroom.
Okay.
Summer's here and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym, it kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com. This deal is only available through the Table Talk link. Okay, next topic we're going to lead into would be the breathing and bracing.
So how important is people's breathing habits outside the gym then leading to performance insights? Because everyone's going to talk about breathing. How do I breathe for a maximal squat? How do I brace for a maximal squat? But if they're coming into the gym with really poor breathing mechanics, which usually ends up leading to poor posture, you know, it's like you said about like wearing crappy footwear 23 hours of the day and then wearing your minimalist shoes for an hour and expecting everything to change, right? So what, even in just a day-to-day sense, are people generally doing wrong with their breathing, which is leading to these kind of downstream effects?
Yeah, absolutely. So to start, obviously I have a hard bias towards believing that breathing, bracing, trunk stabilization is the most important foundation of loaded movement, especially axial loaded movement. And for me personally, I like to look at movement intervention or technique changes as kind of a hierarchy where we always start off with breathing, bracing, trunk stability. Then we go to rooting and foot ankle complex. Then we go hip, shoulder, depends on the movement of the individual. But I like to look at it through that hierarchy because oftentimes when a lifter has 5 different major opportunities for improvement in their lifts, just by taking care of trunk stability, you get rid of 3 of that 5. It's insane how effective it can be. And we always want to start with the changes that create the most holistic effect to their movement quality. And a lot of lifters instead will try to address everything at once, go down a rabbit hole, and nothing ends up actually being done. But when it comes to the discussion of breathing, it's a really interesting one. It's something that I've recently kind of gotten a lot deeper into with some help of some people around me, specifically a clinician who is named Dr. Philip Snell. He has his office is out of my gym. He's someone I collaborate with a lot and ask a lot of questions. And people like him, Sue Falso, and people like that are very good in the industry have kind of turned me on to the idea of even more so doubling down its importance, because people love to talk about breathing in relation to maximizing trunk stability for lifts. And don't get me wrong, that's really, really important. But the problem is that if somebody's stuck in a compensatory vertical stress adapted breathing pattern, trying to work on it and change it within 10 minutes before a heavy set is not only hard to do, I would go as far as to say basically impossible to do. And when it comes to stress adapted breathing patterns that are oftentimes vertical, for people that don't know, something like that we all catch ourselves doing the second we run to stress. When it comes to something like that, it has downsides that go far beyond just maximizing trunk stability for lifting. So one of which, for example, is getting into the autonomic nervous system, which is a very interesting topic. Another one of which you touched on, which is posture. But the nervous system one is rather important for a lot of reasons, especially for athletes and even more so, I would say, lifters, where when we, and there's been a lot of research on this in the last 10 years, when we're stuck in a vertical breathing pattern like this, we end up getting into a place where we are kind of stuck into the sympathetic side of our autonomic nervous system. And for those of you who don't know, parasympathetic is oftentimes described as the rest and digest state, and the sympathetic is often described as the fight or flight. Technically, they're freeze as well, but fight or flight is typically what it's known as. And we are meant to live in the parasympathetic and shift into the sympathetic. And when we are stuck in the sympathetic, there's a lot of effects that ends up happening. Heart rate increases, pupils dilate, so on and so forth. But one of the major downsides for lifters is they can't digest as well. They can't, their appetite isn't quite the same. Sleeping is practically impossible. In fact, I've had lifters I've worked with recently, which I gotta say, I've been guilty of this in the past as well, where they're like, man, I just can't sleep for the life of me. I feel like I work out, I get really amped up, and I just never come down, and I lay awake at night, and I just toss and turn, and I can't go to bed. So I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna take cough syrup and melatonin and this and that and this and that special concoction of drugs and put my ass to sleep, which, don't get me wrong, for a short duration of time can work. Not a great long-term solution, but one of the greatest things you can do to better control your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system, is going to be deep rhythmic breathing application and getting the lifter or person to breathe in more of a horizontal fashion, more of a diaphragmatic fashion. And upon doing that and applying it through some specific drills and positions that force the lifter to do that, all of a sudden they can tap into the parasympathetic, live in the parasympathetic, and things like sleep tends to get a lot better. And this is something that I've been doing for quite some time. It's helped me immensely with that lifter I just mentioned. It helped him a lot too, where one application of many could be simply getting him in a feet-supported 90-90 position or something that forces spine neutrality. And then from there, doing deep rhythmic breathing within a certain cadence. So cadence is oftentimes debated a lot within research as far as what's best for what. But getting them to do that can shift into the parasympathetic, make sleep a lot easier. People typically notice their appetite gets a little bit better, their digestion gets a little better. There's a lot of things in association with it that get immensely better. And the fact of the matter is, lifters tend to take a lot of what? Supplements, stimulants, and what do we have to do before a big lift? We have to get amped. We have to get amped as fuck. But then we tend to stay in that state. We tend to stay in that state for a long time, which hurts a lot of things that I mentioned, and even recovery. So applying deep rhythmic breathing practices that helps to regulate the nervous system, that helps to allow them to stabilize better, that allows them to change their breathing default to more of a horizontal fashion is a really great endeavor. The caveat is it's not all that sexy. In fact, it's not sexy whatsoever. And the hardship is a lot of lifters will try to change their default breathing just in their lifting. Good luck, because you lift an hour and a half a day, 2 hours a day, whatever the case may be, you breathe 24/7. So if you work on it for that duration of time and then immediately shift back to what you're used to, you'll just be chasing your tail your entire life. But the other caveat here, and this is something I've gone through for quite some time, even when you have great success within altering your default breathing pattern and experience some of the benefits I just mentioned, still, the second you run into a stressful situation, you default right back towards that vertical breathing pattern. So for me personally, for example, there's been times in which I first started getting into this where I made huge improvements, started having a lot of success, and then a family member dies or, get in a fight with a significant other or something bad happened at work. And then all of a sudden your first response is, and you change that default like that. So it's something you'll likely have to revisit fairly consistently throughout your life.
Sure. I think this is worth bringing up because it came up yesterday, because you mentioned psyching up for a lift there and stimulants and stuff like that. The preconception is that everyone benefits from that.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right? Mm-hmm. So let's just talk about those, the arousal performance bell curve, right? Let's talk about, everyone knows how to deal with the people on the left-hand side. You shove ammonia in their nose, smack them around the head, tell them you fucking hate them or whatever, right? Let's talk about the people who naturally sit on the right-hand side, whether it's life circumstance or just neurology or whatever, but they're the naturally anxious overthinkers, the chokers. They're looking at that population going, that's what I need to do a big lift, right? Which is not okay. So since we're talking about the effect on the parasympathetic nervous system, are some of these practices some things that those population could actually benefit from in their performance, even when doing those higher stress tasks?
Yeah, and in all honesty, I'd love to ask you 2 questions at this at some point in time as far as some meet day approaches you have. But one of the things I'd love to talk about is meet day approaches, variation of it, and how the biggest mistake coaches make is they always think that that's the right way to get their lifter ready for a meet. If I have 5 lifters in a single day, which I had at this recent nationals oftentimes, I may have 5 fundamentally different approaches to handling them. One lifter, I may have to slap in the back so hard he has red marks for days. One lifter, I may have to simply get him to do breathing drills and calm down. Another lifter, I may have to actively distract from what they're doing and start asking them life questions to get them out of their head, remember commands, and execute come meet day. So when it comes to the breathing application, there's definitely plenty of scenarios where using that as a conduit to getting them to lift more effectively is a very good idea. But the main thing I want to stress a lot is having a singular approach to getting a lifter ready to execute a big lift is a very poorly thought out strategy. And that's what's so important about building rapport with your athlete. You get to see what they respond best to and then emulate that, practice that come meet day. But the hardest part for a coach is handling multiple lifters in a single day and having to change your strategy depend upon the lifter. There's been situations where I catch myself just freaking out, pacing, thinking that a lifter might be about to bomb out. And then I realize I'm giving that energy to my lifter who I need to calm down starts freaking out as well. And then I have to just slap myself out of it, come back to him and be like, hey.
No, that's a good point you just brought up, because you're going to project, to that. So you got to become multiple people in one training session in one day.
It's tough. It's a lot tougher said than done, especially because I'm a bit of a head case when it comes to handling my athletes. I care a lot. And the second something runs awry, or maybe I just got done handling a lifter that needed to get really amped up, to then have a fundamentally different approach is tough. There's been times where I had to run to the bathroom, like look myself in the mirror, calm down, calm down. I have to go back out there and almost act like I just ate an edible or something like that. And just, you're going to kill this. It's not even a big deal. You have to emulate a different energy, because the way I like to put it is you need to be in the mindset you want your lifter to have, in a sense. You have to, because they match your energy, whatever the hell it is. So you have to emulate what the mindset is you want your lifter to be in, which means you have to change your mindset, change your appearance, change the way in which you appear on a multiple times a day basis, which takes some serious practice.
Oh, it's exhausting too.
It's exhausting.
I was going to say, we should flip what we said earlier about should all coaches compete. I think that should be flipped on its head also, where every lifter or competitor should try coaching. Try handle 3 people in a day and just understand what goes in. Like if someone said to me, you've got something really stressful on Monday, on Sunday, would you rather compete or coach? Compete. Every single time, personally. Because like if I take 2 or even 1, but if it's 2 or 3 people through in a day, being a social chameleon for a day for 2 or 3 people, wearing 3 hats, whatever you want to call it, and chances are you probably care almost as much about their lifts as they do, but there's 3 times as many of them because you've got 3 lifters. It's draining to a whole nother level.
Well, there's so many other things that are coming up in my mind with this just from experience, because the one person that you may have to try to keep calm is seeing you get the other person amped up, and they're like, why are you not doing that for me? Right. And it's like, do you not care? Like, slap me. Like, no, it doesn't work that way, and so it's exhausting as hell. The trick is to figure out what that person needs, and if possible, not do 5 people, have other people,
and then
that are there, and there's been multiple scenarios when I was still competing. It's like, keep this person the fuck away from this guy. And keep this, put this one. You're moving people around, like your helpers.
Meet day handling is a beast, and to your point, getting an athlete to experience what it's like should give them some good context. Because when I'm done with a meet, like, I can almost guarantee, in fact, I can guarantee with 100% certainty, especially a multi-day meet, I'm more beat up than my lifter. Because one thing I'm really big on is I don't let my lifter touch a fucking weight. And I'm a big believer in the fact that if you allow your lifter to load bars, then I tend to lose some respect for you. I really like to take care of every single thing for them. But another role you end up unfortunately having is kind of family and friend control, which isn't fun, isn't a fun conversation. But there's some lifters where you might have to say in between lifts, hey, go hang out with your family. A lot of lifters, you have to tell them not to, keep them away from them, and even control their family from going and interacting with them in any way, shape, or form, which is a rather daunting task considering oftentimes you're meeting them there for the first time.
Yeah.
So you come off as a bit of a dick.
Yeah. I've been in that situation too. Yes.
So to backtrack, that was a cool tangent though.
Yeah.
To backtrack back to bracing, you mentioned the difference between vertical and horizontal. Now, people are going to instinctively know what you mean by vertical probably because that's what everyone's defaulting to. Because chances are that's what you're doing right now, right? So let's talk about what you referred to as horizontal breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, a million different terms right there, whatever. What does that look like or feel like from a sensation point of view for someone to know that, okay, I'm in this 90-90 position, my legs are up in the air, I'm bored as fuck. What am I looking for? What's the sensation that I'm digging around for when I want to do this? Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'm going to backtrack a little bit and lay the foundation for understanding why we want it first. Because a lot of coaches, a lot of trainers, no one argues with how important it is, some of which understand it's more important than others. But most people, in fact, I would go as far as say all people understand it's important. But the amount of times that coaches, trainers just gloss over what the hell's actually happening, gloss over the true goals or intent behind it, and to take a step further, can't even explain what's happening mechanistically in the body when we go to do that is truly staggering. So I do think it's important that coaches and trainers have some mechanistic understanding of what's happening, why it's important, what we're looking for, and that can provide the foundation to then coach it effectively. So first off, let's say we're getting ready for a big 1-rep max attempt. We unrack, we walk out, and we're getting ready to set our breathing and bracing. The first thing that happens as I go to prepare to do so and maximize trunk stability as I take in my air is the diaphragm's kind of the initiating action to that. And the diaphragm is vitally important in multiple different ways, but one of the biggest of which in relation to this conversation is going to be it's the kind of conduit to creating the utmost stability. So as I take in my air, my diaphragm descends down towards my pelvic floor and diaphragm work in opposition with one another. And what happens is this compresses the fluids, the gases, the tissues, the contents of my abdomen. Now, as that happens, this eccentrically activates my trunk stabilizers in a 360 sheath. Now, the 360 sheath part is rather important, really important. And this is why we do not want to see, nor should we see, concentric activity of those trunk stabilizers, the hollowing in of the stomach that, credit where credit's due, looks a lot better, looks a lot more aesthetic. I wish that was how we were able to generate trunk stability optimally. But unfortunately it isn't. To do it well is rather unattractive. But point is, those muscles actually eccentrically expand and activate to resist the compression. And then from there, we finish it off with a muscular co-contraction, again, a 360 sheath, to a point where if I were to poke in here, all the way back here, I should feel expansion both with the breath and the brace. And for a lot of people, they're great here. In fact, if I had to break it down to percentages, a good way to breaking it out is about 90% of people can nail this part when they really focus on it. Only about half of people can nail this part. And the back part, the posterior part, the part that's kind of meets your top of your glutes, your lower back, that general area, if you find your last rib, go just under it. That general part, I would go as far as to say 80+% of people have practically no activity in it. And then it can get even more nuance from there, where some lifters will simply have asymmetries. Some lifters, when you go to palpate and test, one side is beautifully active, the other side isn't, which then shifts into conversation. Oh, maybe that's why they have a little bit of hip shift. Maybe that's why they have downstream motor control issues. And that's one of many reasons it could be. You don't want to go too far into that. But point is, though, these are the kind of nuances we're looking for in the mechanistic explanation of what's actually happening internally. So as far as what we're looking for, what's happening, that's kind of what we're going for. But the problem is that when we breathe vertically, a few things happen. But to preface even further, what's required to maximize this is a rib cage over pelvis position. That's what's required to have full mobility, in a sense, of your diaphragm. If we have an elevated rib cage or that common like anterior pelvic tilt position, if we try to breathe from there,
diaphragm cannot descend down the pelvic floor, work in opposition nearly as well. So with this being said, we need this position to be rocked as the prerequisite to be able to maximize our breath, our brace, our eccentric expansion, all that good stuff. But a lot of lifters, when they bias towards a vertical breathing pattern, a lot of negative things happen. One of which being, again, diaphragm doesn't descend down nearly as far. The second of which being, we actually elevate the rib cage to a point where the diaphragm is no longer perfectly lined up with the pelvic floor. Therefore, this process can't happen nearly as well. But take a step further too, when we go into a position like that, that's very, very severe, we typically see the lumbar spine extend. We see passive lengthening of the abdominal musculature. So we're changing length tension relationships of the stabilizers we're relying on to contract and work very hard. But also, if it gets severe enough, we also have downstream changes in length tension relationships. So for example, hamstrings lengthen, quad shorten, a lot of anterior hip musculature changes as well, which is why oftentimes when lifters bias towards this, they tend to have sausage erectors. They tend to have a lot of lower back pumps. They tend to have chronic soreness of the hip flexors. Psoas is beat to shit constantly. A lot of these things are classic indicators of somebody having stabilization strategies that aren't quite ideal for the loads that they're handling.
Sure. So that's just, if we can just delve into that a little bit. So common ways this may present to someone who's maybe not as technically knowledgeable here. On the squat, they unrack, they breathe, bar and shoulders rise. Would that be a red flag to you?
Yeah, that'd be a pretty big red flag. But then again, it does depend a little bit on the severity. Mm-hmm. If somebody starts from the bottom beautifully, it works their way up, and there's a little bit of movement, oftentimes it's not a major concern, especially when they really rock that lumbopelvic position. There's no tilt, there's no anything. That can be a perfectly fine strategy. But when from the very start, we see massive elevation of the collarbone, of the shoulders, and then even worse yet, the barbell as well, that's when I start to get not concerned necessarily, but it starts to be a clear indicator that we need to work on this.
True. And so a really common one that you'll see then is one, and we'll talk about belt usage a little bit further on. If the lifter's wearing a belt, you alluded to the inability to breathe into certain areas. Seeing that gap at the back of a belt, even to the point where it can shift up and down their body, mid squat, mid deadlift, whatever, again, big red flag that's going to be primarily bracing and breathing related for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Though oftentimes, like here's the thing, the prerequisite position to maximize it is really important. So sometimes lifters, for example, this is a really good one, when they get under the barbell and they have massive rib cage elevation, they try to brace from there, unrack from there, squat from there. Sometimes addressing position first can be really helpful because sometimes their breathing and bracing is rather good, but at the same time, they just start in a position that creates that situation. So sometimes positional changes can help to then set the foundation to breathe and brace better in the posterior portion around that belt, because realistically, we should be using that belt as a rigid surface to increase intra-abdominal pressure.
Sure. Okay. So if someone who's stuck, we've addressed how you can use the breathing to kind of get them breathing down into the right place. But let's say we've got that habit here. What would be not necessarily some drills, but ways we can manipulate the exercises and stuff that we're doing to try and bias them towards a more neutral posture? Like, are there things we can do, like maybe in their accessory work, the postures they're using, or certain exercises that you like to maybe plug in to help start ingraining? Because, some exercises are going to give you good feedback when you get it right. Like you're going to feel your abs working. Whereas others, it's, like a back squat, you're not going to feel probably the difference in your abs too much when you've got a super heavy bar on your back. So are there any exercises that you maybe like to plug in, or variations that you like to plug in when you've got a lifter who's trying to make that transition towards a more neutral kind of like set point or habit?
Yeah, really good question. There's a lot of tangents. I try not to go down here. The first of which is, I think that the warm-up, or what I like to call movement prep, presents a really good opportunity to reinforce this. I think there's a lot of mistakes seen or done in warm-ups where there's kind of a false dichotomy that's really, really common, where somebody will either think, you don't need a warm-up, why waste your time with that? And there's other people on the opposite end of the spectrum that think that you need a warm-up for 45 minutes just to have an opportunity to lift heavy weights. The fact of the matter is there's a wide degree of variability. Most people's warm-up, as far as what they do prior to getting on the bar, shouldn't take any more than 10 minutes, but there's plenty of examples where it would take over 10 minutes. So it varies a lot. But all that to say, for this topic, oftentimes the warm-up provides us an opportunity to kind of potentiate positional awareness, breathing awareness, bracing awareness, and achieve that 360 sheath of stability. So I think warm-up is oftentimes a good opportunity. As far as exercise selection goes, one thing worth noting prior to getting into it even is that if you have a lifter that has a hard bias towards that, what I like to call and what many people call the extension compression stabilization strategy, which is simply where lifters will immediately always bias towards bracing from there. That's very, very common. It's even common in youth athletes, which drives me crazy that coaches don't address that. You see them get into a ready position when they're doing athletic training, whether it's plyometrics, lateral disc, whatever. Every position they get into shows that they're not using the entire abdominal wall. They're not able to stack that ribcage over pelvis. So avoiding exercises that reinforce the extension compression stabilization strategy is a really good idea as well. So for example, for a lifter that's really stuck in it, we're trying to improve it, maybe back hyperextension. So they're not inherently bad by any means. Time and place, many examples of when they're great, but maybe exercises like that aren't the best idea in the world if they're really stuck there and you're trying to get them out of it. So avoiding exercises that throws them into it would be a really good idea. But as far as exercises to better execute it, yeah, there's a lot of really good ones. So one of the biggest of which is I want them to learn how to separate breathing and bracing, because a lot of lifters think they're kind of synonymous with one another. They need to be done together. But the fact of the matter is that breathing and bracing, and when I say breathing, I mean the breath hold, they're separate, but they have an additive effect to one another. And getting a lifter to understand that, separate them, is a really good idea. So exercises that force a lifter to maintain a hard, balanced muscular co-contraction, a hard muscular brace while still breathing, is a really good idea. And this can come in many different forms, one of which being some kind of zombie front tempo squat to pins where they're forced to breathe on the way down, because that loading strategy forces them to have really good muscular brace. And then breathing while reinforcing it can be a fantastic idea, really good idea. And one thing to preface before getting into this further is that also understand that the brace is 85%-ish of the equation. So a lot of lifters, again, before they pick up a damn bag of groceries, they hold their breath. You don't need to do that. 85%, all bracing demands are task dependent. So for the vast majority of things we do in our everyday life, as well as accessory lifts, the simple muscular brace, 85% of it is plenty enough. We don't need a breath hold. We only need a breath hold in particular conditions, such as axial loaded lifts, squats, deadlifts, things like that. But also trunk stability is kind of instinctual and needs to happen with virtually anything. So if I reach out to grab this shaker here, there was some stability requirement that needed to happen and did happen instinctually, but it is a task dependent nature where as it ramps up, we may need the breath hold to add to it more. But other exercises that are really good are going to be things like dead bugs, things like you just talked about, the straight arm lat pull down. Hopefully I'm not misrepresenting it too much. But exercise selection that forces them to be more aware of this, to master the muscular brace while still breathing, but also make sure that they are maintaining a neutral position, such as a dead bug with strap. Things like that are really good, because it's a last note worth noting here is that a lot of people don't realize they're in a bit of extension. And oftentimes, if you ask a lifter to send videos online, you yourself as a coach can't really see it. It's really hard to see, especially with something like a dead bug. It could be so minute that you really can't see it from any angle. But if you have them put a backpack strap under their, find the last rib, go a little bit under it, actively pull on it, and then they lock that shit down. They go through some exercises that challenge those demands and increase those demands. Then all of a sudden we can be certain that they're engaging the entire abdominal wall and maintaining that through the entire range.
When we're looking at like loaded movements while someone's going through this progression, would you think it's fair to say that favoring movements that have some kind of anterior loading and less hip flexion is probably a way to go? Because I mean, if we're assuming the problem is the ability to stabilize the trunk, then I would also imagine that the more the trunk changes orientation through a movement, there's more that could go wrong. So if someone, let's say someone's permanently like this on a back squat, trying to expect them to just magically click it into place with a back squat is probably expecting too much. So is that maybe where you'd expect to see maybe in the warm-up some more upright variation, even if it was like a heels elevated goblet squat, or would you use some kind of transition to get them towards implementing it on the bigger lifts where there's more going on?
Absolutely. Yeah, I really like that idea a lot because there's a lot of moving pieces in their competition-specific barbell back squat. And so getting them to do more front-loaded variations, more vertical variations, and variations that kind of allow them to do it more effectively or be more aware of it is a fantastic idea. And what you can also do is you can implement those variations first and then backload their competition-style lift to where they are then more aware, they have really good practice, and they transition to their competition lift. They be very careful and they focus on a lot. And oftentimes you see immediate, really robust effects to it. But also with the barbell back squat, oftentimes they just don't have the shoulder mobility to not go into a elevated rib cage position. And that's another little detail within this, where a lot of people that have limited shoulder external rotation flexion and they get into a really low barbell back squat position, trying to work on position, trying to work on breathing, bracing, trying to eliminate any kind of pelvic tilt that they have is practically impossible. It's really hard, really, really hard. So sometimes the answer with something like that may actually be more so shoulder mobility based. And it may be that doing things like SOTS press, band R&T overhead squats, actual exercises like the Z press, I believe, things like that push and range shoulder flexion or external rotation, some assessments to find out what the major limitation is. Most people, it's both. But doing things like that can be very helpful as well, because there's a lot of prerequisites involved to earn the right or earn the ability to nail this foundation.
Sure. So this is a loaded question on purpose. Do you think an individual actually has an upper ceiling for bracing strength? Or is it something that you can almost infinitely improve? Because it's going to be almost trunk width and thickness of musculature. It's obviously going to improve your bracing potential. But within the parameters of a certain trunk, can you constantly dial it up? Because let's say we take the person from a 400-pound to a 1,000-pound squat over their training career. Their trunk stability has probably increased, even without them knowing, because otherwise that weight wouldn't be happening, right? But if you ask them, could you create 250% more stability? The answer is going to be absolutely not, right? So is it something that in theory you think people can just constantly practice and even at the top level maybe just continue to get marginal gains in?
I've never been asked that. That's a really insightful question. Damn, you're getting me. That is loaded. Man, that's a good one. I have never seen a situation in which somebody can handle a barbell back squat load where their trunk stabilizers didn't have the opportunity to get strong enough to handle it effectively. But at the same time, can somebody infinitely get it stronger to a point where they can potentially handle a 2,000-pound barbell back squat or something like that? I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to think about that further, because it's a really, really good one.
Because we're seeing it with multiply equipment now, right? Like people are squatting 1,300 pounds. If you ask someone maybe 20 years ago before that was happening, I'm not sure when the first 1,200-pound squat was, I'm sorry. Do you think a human torso can stabilize 1,200? People would have gone, no.
Yeah.
If you'd asked someone 10 years ago.
Well, I see the gear's not really helping with that either.
That's what I mean. Yeah, so they still have to, regardless of what the force production is of the gear, the spine and the musculature still has to hold it in alignment. Yeah. And obviously the margin for error is almost nil in that scenario. In the same way that like 10 years ago, if you'd asked, is it possible for the human forearm to handle 1,500 pounds? We'd have said no.
Yeah.
Right. But now we're all being proven wrong. Thank you, Jimmy. So like, in theory, as Equiplifter gives us almost the perfect guinea pig to see like, well, how much can the human torso create in terms of pressure around the spine? Because it's just going up. Yeah. Like when you whether it's a yoke carry in World's Strongest Man or whatever it might be, we can all say equipment's getting better and stuff, but the equipment isn't holding you together. So where is the limit then? Cue the stereotypical images of like Shaolin monks breaking breeze blocks on their, you are the type of thing I'm talking about.
Well, how much, if we go back to what did Paul Anderson do, right? Because some of the quarter squat stuff, like what was that? What was the upper limit that he put on there? Because that might be
over the 1,000 range.
It's definitely over the 1,000 range. For some reason, I'm thinking 2,000.
I think Louis Sir did an expo like 13 or 1,400, like a half squat. Yeah. That was with I think it was with a cage like full of people. Yeah. Or something. It was like a circus show, and you're like, where is this limit then? Because like at some point the muscle force production is going to limit us. Is that actually are we going to run out of muscle and force production before the abdominals are done?
I think the way to kind of look at it is it should never be the limiting factor.
That's
right. That would be that. And if it is a limiting factor, it's 100% on the person not learning how and practicing and strengthening that ability. It shouldn't be just based upon what we're talking about right here. It shouldn't be. But how many times do we say that's the case? Right. And that's the case at the expense of they think they need to do leg extensions to make their quad stronger. So their squat goes out. Right. So,
so like it's an interesting thought, right? If we were all willing to do the amount of practice it would in theory take to maximize our ability to breathe in, the ability to create bracing strength, what would that do to the athletes who are at the highest level if they all did it? I just think that would be really interesting. It's never going to happen. But, you know, like I said, in equip lifting, we're seeing what the human torso is capable of handling. And who knows what that limit is going to end up being.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I don't work with equipped lifters. I don't do equipped lifting. Therefore, I don't really work with equipped lifters because that is something I think you kind of need some experience to really coach effectively. I'd imagine there's a very special feeling that comes with unracking a very heavy bench or
special
heavy squat.
One way to describe it.
Exactly. Special is not the most accurate probably, but one thing I do handle quite often, or coach quite often, is just classic raw lifters. And even them, the trunk stability demands or increase in demands in association with throwing on wraps can be very severe. They oftentimes have to prep for that quite a bit. I wrap a lot of people's legs. I wrap very, very hard. And there's some people I add exponentially more to their ability to squat. And oftentimes we'll have to implement strategies where if they're in the off season, getting ready for a prep, getting ready for applying those knee wraps, we may have to do variations that intentionally increase loading potential that exceeds their normal capacity to prepare their trunk to do so effectively and see what their strategies look like, see what their downsides or faults may look like to kind of structure a plan. But one example, Hatfield squats, for example, that might be a really good idea prior to somebody entering prep where they start throwing knee wraps, where we can kind of see what that typically looks like, or things of that nature. Other examples might be the Mars bar or something to that effect. But two other notes worth mentioning that I want to make sure I mention is one, when we say neutral spine, we don't mean straight. At least I personally don't mean straight, because a lot of people think that neutral, the term neutral, is synonymous with straight, and it certainly isn't. You know, neutral is a bit of a range. So some upper back, some thoracic spine flexion still can be within the range of neutral. A little bit of posterior pelvic tilt, anterior pelvic tilt, still within the range of neutral. And oftentimes when people have these changes in position, it's perfectly fine as long as it's not associated with any pain or dysfunction. Great on you, right? So we're not looking for something that's necessarily perfectly straight by any means. And then one other note, one of the greatest things that I have found, or I'd encourage everybody to do to improve someone's trunk stability, isn't just around strength